She snatched the badge right off his chest, not handed it back. Snatched it, fingers closing around the lanyard, yanking it free in front of 43 employees, who suddenly forgot how to breathe. CEO Evelyn Carter held that badge up like evidence at a trial. "You're done," she said. "Pack your bag and don't come back." The man she fired didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't say a single word. He just picked up his old flight bag, turned around, and walked out the door. 47 minutes later, the airport control tower broadcast one message across every emergency frequency on the eastern seaboard. "Find Viper 1 now. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now, because this story is 5 parts long, and you do not want to miss what happens next." The badge made a sound when it hit the metal inspection table. A small sound, a flat, unremarkable clatter. The kind of sound a set of keys makes when you toss them on a counter at the end of a long night. But every single person standing in Hangar 7 heard it like a gunshot. There were 43 of them: pilots, ground crew, mechanics, 2 junior executives who'd flown in from the New York office the night before. They were arranged in a loose semicircle near the tail section of a Gulfstream G700, the company's newest aircraft, the one that was supposed to carry celebrity clients and corporate titans, in a style that Apex Horizons' marketing department described as the pinnacle of private aviation. The pinnacle of private aviation. Daniel Cross had never once used that phrase. Not because he didn't appreciate a fine aircraft. He appreciated aircraft more than most people in that building appreciated anything. But Daniel was the kind of man who knew that the distance between pinnacle and wreckage was measured not in prestige or price tags, but in maintenance logs, and the attention span of the people responsible for reading them. He was 51 years old, thick through the shoulders, in a way that had less to do with the gym and more to do with 2 decades of hauling equipment across airfields in conditions that would ground most modern flight crews before breakfast. His hair had gone gray at the temples earlier than it should have. His daughter Lily had told him, at age 9, that he looked like a fox. He'd laughed for 3 days straight over that one. It was still his favorite compliment. He wore the same jacket he'd worn for 11 years. Dark navy, worn at the elbows, with a small embroidered patch on the left breast pocket that said nothing, no wings, no rank insignia, no airline logo. Just a patch that had once held something else. Something he'd removed a long time ago. CEO Evelyn Carter stood 6 feet away from him. She was 44, sharp-featured, impeccably dressed in a charcoal blazer that probably cost more than Daniel's truck. She had built Apex Horizon from a mid-tier charter operation into a billion-dollar private aviation brand over 8 years. Through a combination of ruthless client acquisition, aggressive marketing, and an absolute obsession with the company's image. She was brilliant at what she did, and she had absolutely no idea what she was looking at. "This is the 3rd time this month," she said. Her voice was controlled. That was the most dangerous thing about Evelyn Carter. She never screamed. She never lost her composure. She delivered catastrophe in the same tone other people used to order coffee. "The 3rd time you've flagged an aircraft for delay. Do you understand what that costs us?" Daniel didn't look at her. He was looking at the G700. "The vibration in the primary flight control actuator is not a scheduling problem," he said. "It's a structural integrity problem. That aircraft needs to be grounded until the... I have 2 engineers who looked at that aircraft this morning and signed off on it." "Then your 2 engineers missed something." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "That's a serious accusation. It's a serious aircraft." The 43 people in the semicircle didn't move. They'd stopped pretending to be doing anything else approximately 90 seconds into this conversation. Tyler Reed, 29 years old and currently Apex Horizons' fastest rising pilot, stood near the left wing with his arms folded. He had a look on his face that walked the line between amusement and contempt, the look of a young man who was absolutely certain. He understood everything there was to understand about the situation. Marcus Vale stood slightly behind and to the right of Evelyn Carter. He was the operations manager, 50 years old, with the kind of career that had been built brick by brick through small compromises and strategic silences. He'd spent 14 months quietly adjusting maintenance timelines, reinterpreting inspection thresholds, and steering repair decisions in ways that kept costs down and schedules intact. He was very good at his job, depending on how you defined the job. He was the one who had reviewed the report Daniel filed that morning. He was the one who had brought it to Evelyn and described it as, quote, another instance of Cross's excessive caution, creating unnecessary operational disruption. He caught Daniel's eye for exactly half a second, then looked away. Daniel noticed. He noticed everything. I'm pulling this aircraft from today's rotation, Daniel said. Not asking, stating no, Evelyn said. You're not. Evelyn, Miss Carter. The hangar went even quieter, which Daniel would not have thought possible. He looked at her then, directly, calmly, without any of the deference she was accustomed to receiving from people when she used that particular tone. Miss Carter, he said. The vibration pattern I documented this morning is consistent with a developing fault in the fly-by-wire control circuit. I have seen that exact pattern before. I know what it means. And I am telling you, as your senior pilot, as someone with considerably more flight hours in critical conditions than anyone else in this building, that if that aircraft takes off today with a confirmed client on board, you are gambling with their life. Evelyn stared at him. The hangar was so quiet that somebody's radio, somewhere in the back, playing a country station, was audible. Then she said, I'm not gambling. I'm making an operational decision based on the assessment of my engineering team. Your assessment has been overruled. You can't overrule physics.
I can overrule you.
She held out her hand. Daniel looked at her hand, then at her face. Then he reached up and unclipped his access badge from his jacket, the same jacket he'd worn for 11 years, with the empty patch on the breast pocket, and placed it in her palm. Not because he agreed with her. Because he understood something she didn't. Some arguments you win by walking away from them. You are no longer the kind of pilot this company needs, Evelyn said. She held the badge up and laid it on the inspection table with a deliberate final precision. HR will contact you about the paperwork. Please return your equipment locker key before you leave the premises. Someone in the back laughed. A small laugh, quickly swallowed. Tyler Reed didn't swallow his. He looked away, but his shoulders shook. Daniel picked up his flight bag. The old One Army surplus canvas, patched twice on the left strap, with a small sticker on the bottom that Lily had put there 3 years ago. It was a cartoon fox, orange with white ears. She'd found it at a gas station and said, "This is you, Dad." He walked toward the exit. Nobody said a word. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody defended him. He pushed open the heavy hangar door with one hand, stepped out into the pale morning light of a Florida spring, and let it close behind him. What nobody in that hangar knew, what none of them had ever been told, was that Daniel Cross was a name only half the story. The other half had a different name, and that name had been spoken in military aviation circles with a specific kind of reverence, the reverence you reserve for people who operate effectively in situations where effective is the difference between 43 families attending a funeral and 43 families having dinner together. The call sign was Viper 1. It had been given to him during his second year with the 58th Special Operations Wing at Kirtland Air Force Base, not by his commanding officer, but by the crew of a downed MC-130J that he'd brought back to ground in conditions that the official incident report later described as beyond established survivability parameters. What that phrase meant in practical terms was that Daniel Cross had done something the numbers said was impossible. The crew of that aircraft had come up with Viper 1 because they said his voice on the radio during those 41 minutes of controlled chaos had been like a viper, absolutely still, absolutely focused, and absolutely lethal in the most precise and reassuring sense of that word. You heard his voice, and you knew that something dangerous was happening, but that you were in the hands of someone who had already calculated exactly how dangerous it was, and exactly what to do about it. Over the next 16 years, the call sign followed him. Not on paper, not officially. Classified operations didn't come with official nicknames stamped on your service record, but within the tight, quiet community of military aviation emergency specialists, the test pilots, the rescue coordinators, the people who got called when the regular options had run out, Viper 1 was a known quantity. He'd guided 8 aircraft through catastrophic system failures while staying on the ground. He'd coordinated 3 simultaneous emergency landings during a weather event that the National Weather Service later classified as a once-in-40-year atmospheric anomaly. He'd been part of the team that redesigned emergency procedure protocols for 4 different aircraft platforms. Because he had a gift not just for understanding how machines behaved when they were failing, but for being able to explain what to do about it in the kind of clear, calm, unambiguous language that a frightened pilot under impossible pressure could actually use. He'd received 2 commendations. He kept both of them in a shoebox under his bed. He'd left the military 8 years earlier, 18 months after his wife Sarah died of a brain aneurysm on a Wednesday morning in October, while Lily was at school and Daniel was on base, 2,000 miles away. He'd been on a training coordination call when his phone buzzed with the first message. He'd seen the word hospital and stepped out of the room. By the time he got back to the base, Sarah had been gone for 4 hours. He'd made it home by the following morning. Lily had been asleep on the couch with her shoes still on because a neighbor had picked her up from school, and nobody had wanted to be the one to tell her yet. Daniel had sat on the kitchen floor for 45 minutes, completely alone, with the lights off and the refrigerator humming and his daughter breathing softly in the next room. And he'd made a decision, right there on that kitchen floor. He was done being somewhere else. He filed his separation papers 6 weeks later, turned down a civilian contract offer that would have paid 3 times what he eventually made at Apex Horizon, and spent the next 8 months doing nothing but learning how to be present, how to be at the school play, how to be at the birthday dinner, how to be the person who knew which brand of orange juice Lily preferred, and which math teacher made her nervous, and what she needed to hear when she couldn't sleep. He'd taken the job at Apex Horizon because it was local, because the hours were manageable, and because aircraft were the only thing outside of Lily that he'd ever been genuinely, unreservedly good at. He hadn't told them anything about his background beyond the basics. Former military pilot, 15+ years experience, current FAA certifications, impeccable safety record. They'd hired him, and he'd spent 3 years showing up before dawn, inspecting aircraft with his hands and his ears as much as with his instruments, filing accurate maintenance reports, and refusing quietly, consistently, without drama, to let anyone treat flight safety as a negotiable variable. They thought that made him a dinosaur. They thought it made him slow. Tyler Reed had said it best, maybe 6 months earlier, leaning against the nose of a Cessna Citation in the main hangar and talking to one of the younger ground crew. Daniel flies every plane like he's expecting it to betray him. Guys got trust issues with machines. It's kind of sad, honestly. The kid had laughed. Daniel had been 15 feet away, behind a fuel panel, making a notation in his inspection log. He'd written down what he was writing, capped his pen, and moved to the next checkpoint. Trust issues with machines. The truth was the exact opposite. Daniel trusted machines completely. He understood them in the way that a man who had survived real failures understood, not with the breezy confidence of someone who'd never had an engine quit at altitude, but with the deep, clear-eyed respect of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of and exactly what they required. He trusted machines precisely because he never assumed they would do what they were supposed to do, without being given every possible reason to do it. That was not a trust issue, that was the job. He was sitting in his truck in the employee parking lot, 34 minutes after walking out of Hangar 7 when his phone rang. It was Lily. "Hey Dad, you coming to pick me up at 4? I'm free earlier today, actually. How's school?" "Fine. Mrs. Patterson gave us a quiz on polynomials, and I think I actually did okay this time. Because you studied. Because we studied. You're like weirdly good at math for someone who says they're a pilot. Pilots are basically mathematicians with better views." She laughed. "That's so dorky, accurately dorky. Are you okay? You sound, no, different." He looked at the steering wheel for a moment. Lily was 15. She had Sarah's eyes and his stubbornness, and an accuracy about people's emotional states that had been both remarkable and occasionally inconvenient since approximately age 7. "I'm fine," he said. "Dad, I lost my job this morning." A pause. "The airline people?" "Apex Horizon, yeah." "Because of the safety thing?" He looked at her through the phone. That was what it felt like. "How did you know about the safety thing?" "Because you've been coming home stressed for 2 weeks, and you always get stressed when someone's not doing something right about the planes. Did they fire you for pointing out a problem?" "Essentially." She stopped. "That's so stupid. That's so completely stupid." "Are they serious?" "They were serious. They can't just..." Another pause. Then, with the fierce, focused logic of a 15-year-old who had spent her entire life watching her father be the most careful, most responsible person in every room he walked into. "If something happens to that plane, Dad, you know it wasn't your fault, right? You know that? Daniel Cross sat in his truck in the parking lot of the job he no longer had, with the morning sun cutting through the windshield and his old flight bag on the passenger seat with the cartoon fox sticker on the bottom. I know, he said. Promise me, I promise, okay. 4 o'clock? I'll be there at 3:45. Tell Mrs. Patterson good luck on the polynomials. I'll tell her you said that, and she'll think you're weird. Worth it, I love you. Love you too, Dad. He hung up. He sat for another moment. Then he turned the key and started the truck. He was 2 miles from the airport when the emergency radio frequency, he still out of a habit so deep it had become reflex, kept active on a scanner mounted under the dash, went absolutely silent for a full 3 seconds. Then it erupted, not in the calm procedural cadences of routine air traffic control, in the fractured, high-velocity shorthand of people managing something that was going wrong very, very fast. Confirming loss of primary flight control response on FL-380, heading 270, requesting emergency vectors. Apex Horizon 77 Delta, say nature of emergency. Flight control system degradation. Captain reports cycling through backup protocols. No response on primary actuators. We have a flight surface issue. Say again, flight surface issue. Daniel's foot came off the accelerator. He knew the tail number. He knew the aircraft. He knew exactly what flight surface issue meant in combination with no response on primary actuators. He pulled to the side of the road. His hands were very still on the wheel. The fly-by-wire control circuit, the vibration pattern. I've seen that exact pattern before. He sat there for exactly 4 seconds, which is a very long time to sit still when you already know what you need to do. Then he put the truck in a U-turn and drove back toward the airport. Not because anyone had called him, not because he'd been asked, because 186 people were on that aircraft. And because whatever Evelyn Carter had decided about his employment status, Daniel Cross was constitutionally incapable of being the person who drove in the other direction. He was still 2 minutes out when his phone rang. Unknown number, Florida area code, he answered on the first ring. Cross, old habit. He hadn't answered the phone that way in 3 years. There was a half-second of silence, the kind of silence that meant the person on the other end was recalibrating, and then a voice he recognized. Older, worn in the way that 25 years in an air traffic control tower will wear a person. Raymond Kessler, 62 years old, former Air Force controller who'd gone civilian. He'd been at the Apex Horizon Tower for 6 years, and he was one of exactly 3 people at that airport who knew anything real about Daniel Cross's background. Not everything, but enough. Raymond said, "Tell me you're still near the field." 2 minutes out. Thank God. He heard something in Raymond's voice that he had not heard before, something thin and tightly controlled that was working very hard not to become something else. "Daniel, the aircraft your people signed off on this morning. I know. I'm already coming. How? Scanner." Heard the call. "What's the current status?" Raymond pulled a breath. "Captain's name is James Howell. 41 years old, 12,000 hours. Solid record." "Good. He's holding it together. But the primary flight control system is giving him nothing. He's on backups. And the backups are Daniel. I think the fault is cascading. I think whatever started in the primary is bleeding into the redundant systems. Altitude? Coming down through 32,000. He's descending, trying to get under the weather. Conditions at the field are deteriorating. We've got a cell moving in from the southwest. Ceilings dropping. Winds are variable, gusting to 25. Fuel state? Best estimate is 3 to 4 hours. So that's not the critical issue right now. Passengers? 186, including 11 children under 12. Daniel's jaw tightened. He pulled into the airport access road, badgeless, and stopped at the security gate. The guard who was there, a young kid named Darius, who Daniel had spoken to every morning for 3 years, looked up, looked at Daniel's face, and opened the gate without a word. "I need you to patch me into Howell's channel when I get to the tower," Daniel said into the phone. "That's already set up." A pause. "Danya, you need to know something before you come in here. Evelyn Carter is in the tower. She's been here since the emergency call came in. She knows the situation. She knows which aircraft it is." Raymond paused again, and this time the pause was different. "She's the one who asked me to call you." Daniel said nothing. "She didn't know to ask for you specifically," Raymond continued. "She asked if there was anyone at all, who might know how to handle this specific kind of failure. And I—" "He stopped! You told her my call sign! I told her we needed Viper 1!" The parking lot of the Apex Horizon Operations Center appeared on his left. He turned in. What was her reaction, Daniel asked. Raymond Kessler, 62 years old, veteran of 1,500 emergency calls and 25 years of air traffic control, made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else entirely. She went pale, he said, then she ran. He pushed through the operations center doors at a fast walk, not running, not because the situation didn't warrant it, but because running in a crisis environment introduces panic. And panic was the one thing he could not afford to introduce into this building. He heard her before he saw her. Where is he? Raymond said he was coming. Someone needs to call him back. We need to. Evelyn Carter was standing near the base of the tower stairs, with her phone in her hand, and her blazer open, and her hair, he'd never seen her hair less than perfectly arranged, falling out of its clip on the left side. She was talking to Marcus Vale, who was standing with his arms crossed, and his mouth in the tight horizontal line of a man who was measuring how much of what was happening could be attributed to someone else's decisions. She saw Daniel. Her mouth stopped moving. For about 2 seconds, she just looked at him. Her face was a complicated place right now. He could see the CEO in there, trying to reassemble itself from something rawer and more honest that had pushed through during the last 40 minutes. Then Marcus Vale said, "He's not authorized to be in this building. His clearance was revoked." This, Marcus, Evelyn's voice. Quiet, absolute, stop talking, silence. She walked toward Daniel. He had expected he didn't know what he'd expected. Something executive. An apology structured like a press statement. A face-saving formulation that let her keep her dignity intact while getting what she needed. She stopped 2 feet from him. She looked up at him. He had 5 inches on her, and what he saw on her face was not the CEO. It was just a person. A person who had spent the last 47 minutes understanding, in very precise and terrible detail, the cost of a decision she had made that morning. "Daniel," she said. Her voice was almost steady. "I made a serious mistake this morning, and I am." "How much fuel does the aircraft have?" he said. She blinked. 3-4 hours, roughly. Raymond told me. He moved past her toward the stairs. "I need full read access to the aircraft's maintenance log from this morning, the engineering sign-off reports, and the live telemetry feed from the onboard monitoring system. I need a direct channel to the captain, which Raymond is setting up. I need a whiteboard, and I need everyone in that tower who is not directly managing radio traffic to stand clear of the operations console." He was on the stairs, "And I need coffee, black, no sugar." He kept moving. Behind him, he heard Evelyn Carter say something to someone. He didn't hear the words, but a few seconds later he heard footsteps moving quickly in multiple directions. That was fine. That was people doing useful things. He pushed open the door to the control tower. Raymond Kessler looked up. Raymond was one of those men whose entire history lived in his face. Every emergency, every narrow call, every hour of the specific, sustained attention that air traffic control required was written somewhere in the lines and textures of his expression. He was not a man who showed relief easily. He showed it now. "Viper 1, he said, just that. Daniel sat down at the empty communications console Raymond had cleared for him. He put on the headset. He pulled the maintenance log printout that someone had already placed on the console toward him and began reading it, scanning fast, not the broad strokes, not the summary, but the actual data, the numbers, the timestamps, the specific technical language that Marcus Vale had apparently decided the engineering team's sign-off would override. He found what he was looking for in 40 seconds. The notation was small, buried in the secondary systems review section, halfway down the 3rd page. A vibration coefficient reading that was 3 points above the acceptable threshold, annotated by one of the junior engineers with a notation that read, "Within operational tolerance per VP Operations Directive. Schedule compliance." Per VP Operations Directive, Marcus Vale. Daniel set the paper down. He adjusted the headset. He pressed the transmit button. "Captain Howell, this is Daniel Cross, Senior Safety Specialist, Apex Horizon. I'm patched into your channel from the ground. I'm going to help you bring your aircraft home. Tell me what you're feeling in the controls right now." A pause. Then a voicemail, late 30s, Florida in the vowels, with the kind of deliberate steadiness that cost something to maintain. "Cross. Okay, a breath. The control column it's like flying through concrete. I'm getting responses, but they're delayed. 2, maybe 3 seconds of lag on pitch. Roll is better, but inconsistent. I had a full dropout on primary 38 minutes ago. and the backups came online. But I think the fault is in the actuator harness, not the flight computer. I can feel it. The resistance isn't uniform. You're right, Daniel said. The resistance isn't uniform because the fault originated in the primary actuator on the starboard side, and it's creating a torque differential that the backup system wasn't designed to compensate for at this load factor. How much rudder authority do you have? Maybe 60%. Maybe. Good. That's more than enough. Here's what we're going to do. He leaned forward. Outside the tower windows to the southwest, the sky was turning the specific shade of gray-green that meant a storm cell was organizing and had opinions about it. 186 people were in that aircraft. 11 of them were children under 12. And the man they had fired that morning settled into the chair and put his voice into the headset and began to work. Tyler Reed arrived in the control tower 7 minutes later. He'd been on the ground crew when the emergency call came in, and he'd run from the hangar without being told to. Because Tyler Reed was many things, but he was not someone who stayed in the hangar when an aircraft was in trouble. He came through the door fast and nearly walked into Marcus Vale, who was standing against the far wall with his arms still crossed, and his eyes moving between the communications console where Daniel sat and Evelyn Carter, who was standing at the tower window looking out at the southwest sky. Tyler looked at Daniel. Daniel was talking in a low, measured voice, one hand on the console, his eyes on the telemetry display, his other hand making small, precise notations on the whiteboard beside him. He wasn't looking at anyone in the room. He was entirely elsewhere inside the system, inside the problem, inside the specific geometry of a failing aircraft at 30,000 feet above the Atlantic coast. Tyler had laughed 6 months ago. He'd said trust issues with machines and felt clever. He stood in the doorway of the control tower now and felt something shift in his chest. Not guilt, exactly. Guilt required understanding, and he was only beginning to understand. Something closer to reckoning. He found a spot along the wall, out of the way, and he stayed there. He listened. And for the first time since he'd met Daniel Cross, Tyler Reed kept his mouth completely shut and paid attention. Down on the tarmac, 200 meters from the base of the tower, a ground crew member named Yolanda, 18 years at Apex Horizon, mother of 4, the person who knew where every tool in every hangar was kept, stood at the edge of the apron with a radio in her hand and looked up at the control tower windows. She'd been in Hangar 7 that morning. She'd seen the badge get snatched off his chest. She'd done what everyone else did. Nothing. She held her radio a little tighter. "Come on, Daniel," she said quietly, to nobody in particular. The sky to the southwest got darker, and in the control tower, Daniel Cross's voice moved through the frequencies, calm, precise, patient, and completely unafraid toward the aircraft that was carrying 186 people through a failing sky. Viper 1. The name that only experienced people understood. Because when the ordinary options ran out, when the systems collapsed, when every second started oxying something that couldn't be recovered, that voice was what you needed. That voice was already working. And whatever Evelyn Carter had decided about him that morning no longer had anything to do with what was happening right now. The clock on the tower wall read 9:47, and Daniel had been on the channel with Captain Howell for 11 minutes. 11 minutes doesn't sound like much, but in emergency aviation, 11 minutes is an entire education. You learn everything about a pilot in 11 minutes of a real crisis: how they breathe, how they listen, whether they argue with information or integrate it, whether fear lives in their hands, or whether they've managed to keep it somewhere that doesn't interfere with the work. James Howell was a good pilot. Daniel had known it in the first 40 seconds. The man didn't over-explain. He didn't perform calm. He actually had some of it, real and earned, underneath the adrenaline that was obviously running through him. When Daniel asked him a technical question, Howell answered with data, not emotion. When Daniel told him something that contradicted what the backup computer was displaying, Howell didn't argue. He listened, verified with his own hands on the controls, and said, yeah, you're right. The computer's reading lag, not actual position. That was the kind of pilot you could work with. That was the kind of pilot you could bring home. Okay, Daniel said. Howell, I need you to do something counterintuitive right now, and I need you to trust me before your instincts argue with you. Can you do that? Listening. Your backup system is trying to correct the torque differential by increasing input on the port side actuator. That feels like stability to the computer. In reality, it's compounding the problem. Every time the backup corrects, it's putting additional strain on the harness that's already compromised. I need you to reduce your control inputs. I need you to fly lighter. A pause, not long, 3 seconds, maybe 4. You're telling me to ease off. I'm telling you to stop fighting it. The aircraft is still flyable. But right now, you and the backup system are both overcorrecting, and you're wearing out the thing that's keeping you in the air. Back off 20% on the column. Let the aircraft find its own trim. Trust the wings. Another pause. Longer this time. Cross. Howell's voice dropped half a register. I've got 186 people back there. I know exactly how many people you have back there. That's why I'm telling you to ease off. Daniel's voice did not change. Not a degree warmer, not a degree colder. Just steady, clean, present. Trust the wings, Captain. They're still working. Don't exhaust the only thing keeping them working. Raymond Kessler, 2 consoles to Daniel's left, had his headset on and his eyes on the radar return. He'd been watching the cell to the southwest for the last 6 minutes. It was moving faster than the initial forecast. He made a note on his scratch pad and held it up without interrupting. Daniel glanced at it. He read cell accelerating. Revised ETA at field 62 minutes. Ceiling dropping. He gave Raymond a single nod and went back to Howell. Talk to me, he said. What are you feeling? Over the channel, he heard Howell exhale. Then it's okay. Okay, the resistance is decreasing. The column feels lighter. Still delayed but lighter. Good. That's correct. Now hold that input level, and we're going to talk about your descent profile. You're coming down through 28,000. Your field elevation is sea level, and your arrival runway is going to be 27 right, which gives you a crosswind component. I need to know your airspeed, and I need to know what your flap system is telling you right now. Howell read off the numbers. Daniel was already writing, not on the whiteboard now, but on a paper chart, the old-fashioned kind, pencil and protractor that he'd pulled from his flight bag. The one with the cartoon fox sticker on the bottom. Tyler Reed was watching him from across the room. Tyler had not moved from his spot on the wall. He was watching the way Daniel worked. And he was having the specific, uncomfortable experience of realizing that everything he thought he understood about competence was approximately a third of what competence actually looked like in practice. Evelyn Carter was still at the tower window. She'd been there since Daniel arrived. She hadn't spoken to anyone in the room in the last 9 minutes. She was watching the sky to the southwest, and her arms were crossed, but not the way executives cross their arms, not to communicate authority or skepticism. She was holding herself. That was the honest description. She was standing there, holding herself together with her own arms, and watching the sky, like if she looked hard enough, she could personally keep the storm from moving faster than the forecast. Marcus Vail had not moved from his position against the far wall. He had, however, stopped looking at his phone. He was watching Daniel. His arms were still crossed. His expression had not changed in any way that was visible or legible. But something behind his eyes was doing a calculation that you could feel more than see the specific arithmetic of a person who is beginning to understand, with increasing precision, the dimensions of what they have done. The radio crackled. Cross. Howell again. Something new in his voice, not panic, but the edge of something. A roughness that hadn't been there a minute ago. My first officer is telling me he's getting intermittent readings on the number 2 hydraulic system. Pressure fluctuations. Not consistent, but they're happening. Daniel's pencil stopped moving. Raymond was already pulling up the secondary systems display. Daniel said, fluctuations or drops, fluctuations so far. But they're getting wider. 3 psi variance 10 minutes ago. Now it's closer to 9. Daniel looked at Raymond. Raymond held up 2 fingers, then pointed to the display. The number 2 hydraulic system on the G700 shared a pressure manifold with the primary flight control actuator circuit. If the fault had propagated from the actuator harness into the hydraulic lines. Howell, how's your gear cycling? Haven't tested it. Test it now. Gear down, then immediately back up. Don't leave it extended. I want to know if the hydraulic response is normal. A pause, then the sound of switches, then gear extension nominal. Retraction cross. Retraction is slow. I've got a 3-second lag on retraction where there should be a ½ second. Daniel put his pencil down. 3-second lag on hydraulic retraction. Number 2 system pressure fluctuating. Primary actuator fault already confirmed. He looked at the maintenance log. He looked at the engineer's notation. Within operational tolerance per VP Operations Directive. He thought about Marcus Vale. He thought about Sarah's kitchen floor at 2 in the morning, 8 years ago. He thought about Lily saying, "You know it wasn't your fault, right?" Then he set all of that down somewhere internal where it would wait. Because none of it was useful right now, and the only thing that was useful right now was the next decision. "Howell," he said, "good news and bad news first. Your number 2 hydraulic system is beginning to fail. The fault is cascaded originated in the primary actuator circuit, and it's migrated into the hydraulic lines. This consistent with what I expected. It's bad, but it's not fatal, and here's why." "Tell me why." "Because the G700 has triple redundant hydraulic systems, and you still have full integrity on systems 1 and 3. You can land this aircraft on systems 1 and 3 with appropriate procedure modifications. You've got more runway than you need. You've got fuel, and you've got 60% rudder authority, which, with the crosswind component on 27 right, is actually more than comfortable." He paused. "The good news is that nothing new has broken. This is the same fault, spreading predictably. Predictable is workable." Silence on the channel for exactly 2 seconds. "You knew this was going to happen this morning," Howell said. It wasn't an accusation, it was just a statement. The kind of statement that arrives when someone is in the middle of a real crisis and their mind, which is a very efficient machine, puts together available information and reaches a conclusion. "Yes," Daniel said, "and they flew us anyway. I'm going to need you to set that down for now," Daniel said, "because we're going to have time to be angry about this later, and you're going to want your full capacity for that conversation. Right now, I need your full capacity for this one." Another pause. "Yeah," Howell said. "Yeah, okay, a breath. Tell me about the landing." Daniel picked his pencil back up, and the clock on the tower wall read 9:54 a.m., and there were 186 people at 31,000 feet who did not know, yet, how close the morning had come to ending very differently. The storm cell to the southwest had its own timeline and did not care about any of them. But Daniel Cross had been here before, not this aircraft. Not this exact fault pattern, not this exact storm. But here in this place where the clock was running, and the options were narrowing, and the only thing that stood between catastrophe and morning was a voice, a pencil, and the specific kind of knowledge that cannot be faked, purchased, or abbreviated. He had been here 18 times over 16 years. 17 of those times everyone came home. He did not think about the 18th time. He began talking Howell through the landing approach. Yolanda was still on the apron when the PA system clicked on, and the airport operations director's voice came through the speakers, steady and professional, announcing that all non-essential personnel should clear the tarmac, and that emergency response vehicles were being positioned as a precautionary measure. She heard precautionary measure and knew what it meant. She'd been at Apex Horizon for 18 years. She'd seen 2 emergency landings in that time, both minor, both resolved without incident. She'd never heard the PA use that phrasing. She looked at the tower windows. From down here, she could see a silhouette at one of the consoles. She couldn't make out the face, but she could see the posture leaning forward, one hand on the console, completely still in the specific way that people are still when they are concentrating so hard that stillness is the only thing they can afford. She knew that posture. She'd watched it every morning for 3 years. Her radio crackled. "Yolanda, we need the foam units positioned on 27 right. Emergency precautionary," on it she said. She started moving, but she kept her eyes on the tower windows for another 3 seconds before she looked away. In the tower, Raymond Kessler was managing 2 other aircraft, simultaneously routing them away from the field, extending holds, coordinating with the regional center, while tracking the G700's transponder return and monitoring the approaching weather. It was the kind of work that required the ability to hold multiple streams of information in your attention simultaneously without any of them degrading, and Raymond Kessler was very good at this, had been good at it for 25 years. But he'd never done it while Daniel Cross was at the console next to him. It felt different. He couldn't fully articulate why, except that the room itself felt different. Not calmer, the situation was genuinely dangerous, and everyone in the room knew it. But more organized, like the emergency had a shape now, and the shape was manageable. He thought about the morning, about Evelyn Carter asking him if there was anyone who could help, and about the moment he'd said the call sign, and about the look on her face. He'd known about Daniel for 2 years, before Daniel even came to Apex Horizon. They'd crossed paths once briefly at an aviation safety conference in Atlanta, where Daniel had sat in the back row of a session on emergency procedures and asked 3 questions that had completely reframed the way the panel presenter was thinking about the problem. Raymond had introduced himself afterward, and Daniel had been courteous and brief, and had moved on without seeming to notice that he just quietly dismantled and reassembled an expert's argument in front of 60 people. Raymond had filed that away. When Daniel came to Apex Horizon, Raymond had shaken his hand on the first day and said simply, "I know who you are." Daniel had said, "I'm a pilot, nice to meet you." That had been that. And for 3 years, Raymond had watched Daniel show up before dawn and inspect aircraft and file accurate reports and refuse to bend on the things that couldn't be bent. And he'd kept quiet because it wasn't his place to tell stories that weren't his to tell, and because Daniel clearly wanted it that way. And now here at 9:58 on a Tuesday morning in May, Raymond Kessler was watching what happened when Viper 1 came home. The channel opened. Howell's voice. "Cross. I've got a question and I need you to give me a straight answer. Go. If the number 2 hydraulic system fails completely on final approach full failure, not fluctuation, do we go around or do we commit?" Daniel's pencil stopped. This was the question. This was the real question, the one that had been underneath the conversation for the last 18 minutes. The one that Howell was good enough to know he needed to ask out loud instead of leaving it unspoken. Go around execute an aborted landing approach and try again required hydraulic pressure for the go-around maneuver. If System 2 failed completely on final, a go-around would put maximum demand on a compromised system at exactly the moment when maximum demand was least survivable. Commit hold the approach and land no matter what meant that if the crosswind component increased and the aircraft became uncontrollable in the last 500 feet, there was no recovery option. Both choices carried weight. Daniel looked at the chart. He looked at the weather data Raymond had updated on the screen to his left. He looked at the runway length notation and the foam unit positions that Yolanda's crew was currently establishing. He thought about Howell's voice. 12,000 hours. Solid record. Good pilot. He thought about 11 children under 12. "You commit," he said. "Here's why. Your System 1 and System 3 are intact, and they're going to stay intact because the fault pathway is contained in the manifold between primary actuators and System 2. It cannot propagate to the other systems, the design won't allow it. On final approach, I'm going to walk you through a modified control input sequence that will give you effective authority on Systems 1 and 3 alone. It won't feel normal. It's going to feel like you're flying with one hand. But you've got more than enough runway, and I'm going to be on this channel every second of the approach. A beat. You commit because you're a better pilot than the go-around option needs you to be, and I'm not going to waste that." The channel was quiet for 4 seconds. Then Howell said, "Okay, walk me through the sequence." And somewhere in the back of the aircraft, a flight attendant named Maria was moving quietly through the cabin, checking seatbelts, checking seat positions, keeping her face in the professional arrangement that flight attendants maintain, because passengers take their cues from the crew. The passengers knew something was happening. You can't fully hide an emergency from 186 people. There's a quality to the silence that settles over a cabin crew when the situation is real that registers somewhere primal in the people watching them, regardless of what is or isn't announced. A woman in 14C had been holding her daughter's hand for the last 20 minutes. Her daughter was 8. Her daughter had asked twice if everything was okay, and the woman had said yes both times in a tone that was very close to convincing. The man in 22A had fallen asleep 40 minutes before the emergency began, and had woken up to the changed quality of the cabin air, that specific undefinable difference, and was now sitting with his eyes closed again, hands flat on his thighs, running through something in his mind, a prayer maybe, or the equivalent of one. In the last row, a teenage boy was gripping his armrest with both hands and watching the wing out the window like it owed him an explanation. None of them knew about Daniel Cross. None of them knew what Viper 1 meant. They only knew what they could feel the aircraft moving beneath them in a way that was not quite right, and a crew that was holding very still, and a sky that looked like it was changing its mind about the day. In the tower at 10:07 a.m., Marcus Vale made a sound. Not words. Just a sound sharp, involuntary. The kind of sound a person makes when something changes on a screen they've been watching. Everyone looked at him. He was staring at the telemetry display. His arms had uncrossed themselves. "The number 2 system," he said. Not to anyone specifically. The pressure just dropped. It's falling. It's not fluctuating anymore. I know," Daniel said. He hadn't looked up. "Howell, you're about to feel a change in the control response. System 2 hydraulics are going to full failure in approximately 90 seconds. This is expected. When it happens, you're going to feel a pull to the left. Counter it with right rudder, not column rudder. And I need you to reduce your descent rate to 700 feet per minute. Can you confirm?" Howell's voice. "Confirmed. Right rudder, 700 FPM descent rate. Standing by. Standing by with you." The telemetry display showed the number 2 hydraulic pressure reading trending downward. Everyone in the tower was watching it. The room had the specific quality of held breath that fills spaces where people are waiting for something inevitable. Raymond's hand moved to his radio. He'd already coordinated the emergency vehicles. He was now checking that the foam units were properly positioned, that the medical crews were staged, that the crash fire rescue team leads were on their channels. Not because he expected a crash. Because when Daniel Cross said something was expected, you made sure everything was ready for it. The pressure reading touched 0, and Howell's voice came through the channel controlled. Immediate. Right on cue. Left pull. Countering. Right rudder applied. I've got it. I've got Cross. I've got it. Good. Hold that input. How's your descent rate? 740. Correcting to 700. Good. Now here's what comes next. Marcus Vale sat down on a chair near the wall. Nobody looked at him. He put his face in his hands. Evelyn Carter, at the window, turned and looked at him. Her expression was not anger. It had moved through anger in the first 20 minutes and arrived somewhere beyond it, somewhere quieter and harder and more honest. She looked at Marcus Vale with his face in his hands, and she thought about the notation in the maintenance log. Per VP Operations Directive. She thought about how many times over the last 14 months she'd told him she needed cost managed and schedules maintained. She thought about the specific ecosystem of pressure and incentive she had created. And she thought about a maintenance engineer who'd found a threshold violation and reached for the most available explanation, the one his boss had given him, instead of the one that would have grounded an aircraft. She looked at Marcus Vale for exactly 5 seconds. Then she looked back at the telemetry display. Because there were still 186 people in the air. And this was not the moment for accountability. That moment was coming. It was a very specific, well-populated moment, and everyone in this room was going to be in it. But it was not yet. Cross Howell again. The approach was beginning. The aircraft was descending through 12,000 feet, inbound to the field, and the storm cell that didn't care about anyone's schedule was sitting to the southwest, with winds that were now gusting to 31. "I want to tell you something." "Tell me on the ground," Daniel said. "I'll tell you now because I need to say it now. A beat. I've been flying for 18 years. I've had 2 emergencies. Both times, the voice in my ear made the difference between whether I thought I could do it or whether I knew I couldn't. You're making me feel like I know." A pause. "I want you to know that." The tower was very quiet. Daniel looked at the chart. "Then let's make it worth knowing," he said. "Gear down on my mark. We're going to do this right, Captain. Ready?" "Ready." Gear down in 3, 2, 1, mark. On the radar return, the transponder blip that was Apex Horizon 7 Delta continued its steady, careful descent toward the field. The storm cell moved. The clock read 10:19 a.m., and Tyler Reed, against the wall, realized his hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something harder to name, the experience of watching someone do a thing with complete mastery. The experience of understanding for the first time what mastery actually looked like from the outside, when you'd only ever seen its surface. He'd laughed 6 months ago, trust issues with machines. He stood there with his hands shaking slightly, and his mouth shut, and he watched Daniel Cross talk an aircraft out of the sky, and he understood, with a clarity that arrives maybe a few times in a life, that he had been looking at the wrong thing for 3 years. He hadn't been watching Daniel, he'd been watching Daniel's jacket. The runway appeared through the tower windows. 7 right. Foam units positioned. Emergency vehicles staged in 3 locations. The runway lights on, even in the morning light, because the ceiling had dropped enough to warrant it. The radio brought Howell's first officer's voice briefly. Behind Howell, field in sight. "We've got the field." And then Howell Cross, "I've got the field." Continuing approach, Daniel leaned forward. "I'm right here," he said. "You've got this. Let's bring them home." The aircraft was a small shape against the gray-green sky to the northeast, growing steadily larger. You could see it from the tower windows. Now you could see the angle of it, the slightly asymmetric alignment that was the visual signature of the compromised control system, being managed rather than corrected. The small, continuous corrections that Howell was making as he followed Daniel's input sequence. Raymond Kessler watched the radar. He watched the aircraft. He said nothing. Yolanda, on the apron, stopped what she was doing and looked up. The woman in 14C had her daughter's hand in both of hers now, and was pressing her lips together and looking at the seat back in front of her. The man in 22A had opened his eyes. The teenage boy in the last row had stopped looking at the wing. He was watching the flight attendant. And the flight attendant, Maria, who had been doing this for 11 years and had seen 3 declared emergencies, and who loved this job in the specific, unguarded way that you love something that is actually your calling. Maria was standing very still at the front of the cabin with her harness fastened and her hands folded, her face in the professional arrangement that had gotten her through the last 3 emergencies. But her lips were moving very slightly. The aircraft descended through 500 feet. Daniel's voice airspeed, call it Howell 142. Correcting to 138. Crosswind. What are you feeling? Manageable. It's manageable. Right of center line by about 10 feet. Correcting. Don't chase it. Let it come back naturally. You're good. You're set up right. Trust the wings. 400 feet. 300. 200 feet, Howell called. His voice had changed. Not worse, tighter. The specific tightness of a pilot who can see the ground and whose hands are doing the thing their brain has been preparing for the last 40 minutes. You're good, Daniel said, steady. Don't add input. Hold what you have, 100 feet, 50. The aircraft crossed the threshold of runway 27 right. The foam units on either side of the center line were a blurred visual that the pilots weren't looking at. They were looking at the center line. They were trusting the voice. Flare, Daniel said. Now the main gear kissed the runway. One wheel, then the other. Not simultaneously, the asymmetric control made it a split-second sequence. Left main, then right main. A bounce. A hard correction from Howell that anyone who'd spent time in cockpits would recognize as the work of very good hands. The aircraft settled, the nose came down, and Daniel Cross sat back in his chair and released a breath so quietly that nobody in the room heard it. But Raymond Kessler, who had known him for 3 years, and had sat 2 consoles away for 18 of the longest minutes of the morning, saw his shoulders drop exactly half an inch. And he knew the aircraft was rolling down the runway. Decelerating. The emergency vehicles were moving in flanking position, which was standard, which was right, which was exactly what they should be doing. The radio channel crackled, Howell's voice. It took him a few seconds to say anything. When he did, it was just 2 words, and his voice was doing something that it hadn't done for the entire previous 41 minutes. We're down, the tower erupted. Not loudly, not like a movie. It was quieter than that, a compressed, intense release of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, coming out in the form of Raymond's hands, dropping to his knees, and a female controller 2 positions over pressing both palms flat on her console and closing her eyes, and someone behind Daniel saying, "Oh, thank God," in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Evelyn Carter at the window pressed one hand flat against the glass. She watched the aircraft roll to a stop. She stayed like that for a long moment. Then she turned around and looked at Daniel Cross. He was removing his headset. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't doing anything externally that looked like what had just happened. He was just removing headset and setting it on the console, and picking up his pencil and drawing a quiet horizontal line at the bottom of the chart he'd been using during the approach. Like closing a file, like finishing a piece of work. Evelyn Carter watched him do that. And something in her chest did a thing that she would have found difficult to describe in a quarterly earnings call or a board meeting, or any of the other contexts in which she was accustomed to choosing her words carefully. It felt distantly like the beginning of understanding how much she had not understood. Tyler Reed, against the wall, let out a breath. He looked at his own hands. They'd stopped shaking. He thought about the aircraft in the hangar. He thought about the morning. He thought about the badge getting snatched off the chest of the man who had just talked a failing aircraft out of the sky with a pencil, a chart, and a voice that never once changed its register. He thought, with the specific humility of a person who has just been given an education they didn't ask for. What exactly did I think I was laughing at? Marcus Vale still had his face in his hands. On the tarmac, the passenger door of 77 Delta opened, and the first person down the air stairs was a small girl, maybe 8 years old, who ran across the apron toward a waiting gate agent and then stopped and looked around, like she was trying to understand where she was. And Maria, the flight attendant, came down the stairs behind her and stood at the bottom and, for approximately 4 seconds, dropped every bit of the professional arrangement from her face. Then she picked it back up, because there were still passengers deplaning, and that was still her job, and she was still very good at it. The clock on the tower wall read 10:31 m, 44 minutes since the emergency call. 186 passengers, all of them on the ground. All of them safe. Daniel Cross picked up his flight bag, the one with the cartoon fox sticker on the bottom. He stood up from the console, and the first person who spoke to him, not Evelyn Carter, not Raymond Kessler, not Tyler Reed, was a young controller named Sophie, 26 years old, 3 months on the job, who had spent the entire emergency standing very still near her console, because nobody had told her to do anything else, and she'd been afraid that, if she moved, she'd somehow disrupt whatever was happening. Sophie looked at Daniel Cross and said very quietly, "How did you know you could do that?" Daniel looked at her. He thought about the question. Then he said, "I've been doing this a long time and I wasn't sure I could do it." He paused. "I just knew I had to try." Sophie nodded. She looked like she was filing that away somewhere. Daniel Cross walked toward the tower door, and behind him, in the room, the morning's work began settling into its permanent shape. What had happened, what it meant, what came next. But one person in that room was already thinking further ahead than the others. Marcus Vale had taken his face out of his hands. His expression had changed. It was not remorse. It was calculation. And nobody, in the release and relief of those first minutes after the aircraft stopped, was watching him closely enough to notice. The clock read 10:31 a.m. when Daniel Cross walked out of the control tower. He did not stop to accept congratulations. He did not turn around when Raymond called his name from the top of the stairs. He kept walking down the tower stairwell, through the operations corridor, past the cluster of ground crew who had gathered near the base of the building when word spread that the aircraft was down safe, past Yolanda, who was standing with her radio in her hand, and her eyes wet, and who reached out and gripped his arm for exactly 1 second as he passed, which was more than enough. He pushed through the exterior door and walked out onto the apron. The air hit him. Florida May, thick and warm, with the approaching storm giving it an edge that the morning hadn't had an hour ago. He stopped walking and stood there for a moment with his flight bag over his shoulder and his eyes closed. He counted to 5. That was all he allowed himself. 5 seconds to feel the weight of the last 44 minutes, to let it pass through him without either shutting it down or giving it more room than it deserved. Then he opened his eyes. He had to pick up Lily at 3:45. That was the next thing. That was always the next thing. He was halfway across the apron, moving toward the employee lot where his truck was parked, when he heard the door behind him, and footsteps that were moving too fast for anyone who wasn't chasing something. "Daniel," he stopped. He turned around. Evelyn Carter was walking toward him with her blazer open, and her hair still half out of its clip, and her shoes expensive, inappropriate for wet tarmac, making sounds against the concrete that seemed too loud for the morning. She stopped 6 feet from him. She was breathing slightly harder than normal. Not from the walk, from whatever it had cost her to come through this door at all. He waited. "I don't know how to—" She stopped, started again. "I've been running this company for 8 years. I've made hard calls. I've made unpopular calls. I've been told I was wrong before, and most of the time it turned out I wasn't." She looked at him directly, and what was in her face was not the CEO. He'd seen the CEO fall away in the tower, and it hadn't come back yet. "This morning I was wrong in a way that could have killed 186 people. And I'm standing here right now, trying to find the words for that. And there aren't any." Daniel studied her face. He'd worked for her for 3 years. He'd disagreed with her in meetings. He'd filed reports he knew she was going to ignore. He'd watched her make decisions that prioritized the look of the thing over the substance of it, and he'd been frustrated, and he'd been accurate, and he'd been, this morning, publicly dismissed in front of 43 people who took their cues from her response to him. He'd felt all of those things. Right now, standing on the apron with the storm moving in from the southwest, and the aircraft sitting safe on runway 27 right, he felt something else. Something closer to tired. "I told you this morning," he said. "I told you the aircraft had a problem, I know. You chose the schedule. I know. You let Marcus Vale tell you the problem wasn't real, because it was more convenient for you to believe him." Evelyn's jaw worked. "Yes," she said, yes. That's what happened. And one of your engineers put his name on a safety notation and wrote per VP Operations Directive because he needed to keep his job, and Marcus gave him the language to do it." Daniel paused. "How many times has that happened, Evelyn? How many times has Marcus found a way to make a problem disappear on paper without actually fixing it?" She looked at him. He could see the answer moving through her face before she spoke it. Not a simple answer, not a clean one. The specific expression of someone who is realizing that a pattern they'd been too busy or too willing to examine has been running in their organization for longer than they want to admit. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know the full scope of it yet." "Then you need to find out today." He shifted the flight bag on his shoulder. "Not because of the liability, not because of the FAA investigation that's going to start in about 3 hours. Because there are other aircraft in your fleet that have been signed off on by people working under the same directive. And some of those aircraft are going to fly today." Evelyn's eyes went wide, not in a performative way, in the way of someone who has just been handed a specific operational emergency where the last one hasn't fully finished yet. She reached for her phone. "Ground them," Daniel said. "All of them, until you've audited every maintenance log for the last 14 months. That's She stopped. "I know what it costs," he said. "Ground them anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she put the phone to her ear and started talking, walking back toward the building, her voice shifting back into the register that ran the company, clipped, precise, carrying the specific authority of someone who has just made a decision and is not going to unmake it. Daniel watched her go. Then he started walking toward the parking lot again. He got approximately 40 feet before his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, Washington, D.C. area code. He almost didn't answer it. He answered it. "Mr. Cross," a male voice, not young. The particular cadence of federal government measured even, not given to unnecessary warmth. "My name is Alan Pruitt. I'm a senior investigator with the National Transportation Safety Board. We've been monitoring the emergency response this morning, and I understand you were involved in coordinating the landing guidance for Apex Horizon 77 Delta. That's correct. I'd like to speak with you in person before the end of the day. We're going to need a full account of what you knew about the aircraft's condition this morning, when you knew it, and what actions were taken or not taken in response to your assessment." Daniel stopped walking. "You want to know if I can document what I filed and when I filed it, among other things." He thought about the maintenance log. The third page, the notation in Marcus Vale's name. "I filed an inspection report at 6:47 this morning through the Apex Horizon digital maintenance system. That report contains my full technical assessment of the primary actuator vibration pattern. It has a timestamp and my digital signature. It was reviewed and overridden by the VP of Operations." A pause, longer than expected. "Mr. Cross, are you saying there is documentation in the company's system showing that you identified this fault before the aircraft took off?" "I'm saying there's documentation showing I identified it, reported it through proper channels, and was overruled, and then was terminated." In that order, another pause. "I can have copies of my personal inspection notes to you this afternoon. I photograph my inspection logs, everyone." The voice on the other end was quiet for 3 seconds, in a way that felt like someone writing something down. "That would be very helpful," Alan Pruitt said. "Where can we meet?" The clock in Daniel's truck read 10:44 a.m. when he pulled out of the Apex Horizon parking lot. He'd photographed every inspection log, every maintenance notation, every personal note he'd made in his 9 months covering the G700 fleet, and sent the files to Alan Pruitt's NTSB email address before he left the lot. The files were time-stamped. They were clear. They told a story that didn't require interpretation. He drove for 11 minutes. He pulled into the parking lot of a diner 4 miles from the airport because he hadn't eaten anything since 5:30 that morning, and his hands, which had been completely steady for the last hour and 40 minutes, were now doing a very small, quiet shake that he recognized as the back end of sustained adrenaline and knew food would fix. He ordered coffee and eggs and sat in a corner booth and looked out the window at the parking lot. His phone had 17 missed calls. News, mostly he recognized 2 national aviation journalist numbers from press releases he'd seen cross his desk. One call from a number he didn't recognize with a Tampa area code. One from Tyler Reed, which surprised him enough that he stared at it for a moment. He called nobody back. He drank his coffee and ate his eggs, and he sat with the morning for a few minutes in the way that you sit with something after it's over. But before you fully understood what it means, he thought about Sarah. He did this sometimes after things. Not in a painful way exactly, or not only painful. He thought about what she would have said. Sarah had been a high school science teacher, intensely practical, with a sense of humor that ran very dry and very deep. And she had a gift for the one-sentence summary that cut through whatever complicated thing Daniel was carrying and left him with the clearest possible version of it. He thought about what she would have said about this morning. He thought she probably would have said something like, "You did your job, Daniel. Now eat your eggs." He smiled at the window. He ate his eggs. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. He opened it because the message preview said only, "Cross." "It's Howell. Got your number from Raymond. I need to tell you something." He replied, "Go ahead. 3 seconds, not in a text." "Can you meet? I'm at the airport medical facility. They want to keep us for observation for a few hours. But I need to talk to you before the NTSB gets to me." Daniel looked at the message. He looked at the time. 11:08 m. He finished his coffee. He left 2 20s on the table and walked back to his truck. The airport medical facility was a 2-story building adjacent to the main terminal. And when Daniel arrived at 11:23 a.m., the lobby was more populated than usual. He could see through the glass frontage that several people in Apex Horizon crew uniforms were seated in the waiting area, along with a few people in civilian clothes who had the specific shell-shocked stillness of passengers who'd been directed here by airport staff and weren't entirely sure why. He gave his name at the desk. The nurse who came to escort him back looked at him in a way that suggested she'd been briefed about who he was. Not celebrity recognition, something more specific. The particular look of someone who's been told a piece of context that changes how they see the person in front of them. She led him to a room at the end of the corridor. Captain James Howell was sitting on the edge of a medical bed in his uniform shirt jacket off, tie loosened. He was a lean man with close-cut dark hair that had gone gray at the temples, and he looked like someone who had been very keyed up for a long time and was now in the difficult, depleted territory on the other side of it. There were 2 lines between his eyebrows that hadn't been there before this morning. Maybe they had. Daniel couldn't know. Howell looked up when Daniel came in. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Howell stood up and reached out his hand. Daniel shook it. "Sit down," Howell said, "please." They sat Howell on the edge of the bed, Daniel in the one chair in the corner. The room was quiet. Someone had left a cup of hospital coffee on the windowsill, and it was going cold. "I need to tell you something," Howell said. "And I need to tell you before I tell the investigators, because I want you to know it first." He looked at his hands. "When I was on final approach and you told me to commit when you said I was a better pilot than the go-around option needed me to be, I almost didn't believe you." Daniel waited. "Not because I doubted you," Howell said. "Because I doubted myself. I've been flying for 18 years, and I've never had an approach that felt like that. Like the aircraft it felt like it was fighting me. And I had 150 people back there, counting on me to make a decision I wasn't sure I could make correctly." He looked up. "I want to know how you knew I could do it." "I didn't know," Daniel said. Howell blinked. "I made an assessment," Daniel said. "I assessed your performance over the previous 40 minutes. The way you responded to information, the quality of your corrections, the accuracy of your callouts. I determined that your skill level was consistent with what the approach required." He paused. "But I didn't know. Nobody knows in those situations. You make the best assessment you can and you commit to it. That's the job." Howell looked at him for a long moment. "You make it sound simple. It's not simple," Daniel said. "It just sounds that way after it works." Something moved across Howell's face, relief and grief, and something that was harder to name. He dropped his gaze to the floor. "I have kids," he said. 2 daughters, 7 and 9. I called my wife before they brought me in here. She didn't know anything had happened yet, and when I told her," he stopped. "It took me a minute to get through the call. She kept saying she was fine, and I kept hearing that she wasn't, and I couldn't. I couldn't tell her how close. You don't have to, Daniel said. She's going to find out. The story is already moving. I've already had 3 texts from people who saw something on the news feeds. Then she'll find out that you brought the aircraft home. We brought it home. Daniel looked at him. I want that on record, Howell said. When the investigators talk to me today, I'm going to tell them exactly what happened and exactly what you did. Every instruction, every call-out, every decision point. I'm going to tell them that the man who saved that aircraft was the same man who tried to ground it this morning and got fired for it. His voice had found an edge now, not at Daniel, but at something else. At the shape of the morning. At the specific absurdity of what it had cost to arrive at a safe outcome that should have been preventable. That is going to be on record. Daniel nodded. I also need to tell you something else, Howell said. About why I need to say it before the investigators get here. He paused. I got a call this morning, 30 minutes before departure, from the operations center, from Marcus Vale. Daniel went still. He called to tell me that a senior pilot had raised some concerns about the aircraft, but that engineering had reviewed and cleared it, and that the company had high confidence in the aircraft's airworthiness, and that the client relationship for this flight was, his word, strategically significant. And then he said something that I've been thinking about since I landed. Howell looked at Daniel directly. He said, "We just wanted you to have full context before you pushed back from the gate." The room was very quiet. Full context, Daniel said. Full context, Howell repeated. He called the captain of the aircraft, 30 minutes before departure, to tell me that someone had flagged the aircraft and that the company wanted me to have that information, but framed in a way that made it clear the expectation was that I'd depart. He shook his head. It wasn't a warning, it was insulation. He was covering himself. If something happened and I survived, he could say he'd informed the captain. If nothing happened, business as usual. Daniel sat with that for a moment. Marcus Vale had known. Not just that the problem existed, Daniel had already known that Vale had seen his report. But Vale had known specifically enough to call the captain, to build a paper trail that placed the final departure decision in the captain's hands while obscuring who'd created the conditions for the decision. That wasn't negligence anymore. That was something with a different name. You need to tell the NTSB exactly what you told me, Daniel said. Word for word, the time of the call, the content, the phrasing. I know, Howell looked at him. That's why I called you first. I wanted you to know that whatever he did to you this morning, the firing, the whole thing, I don't think this morning was the first time he's done something like this. I think this is a pattern, and I think the investigators are going to find it, and I think the man who needs to be at the center of that investigation is not Evelyn Carter. He paused. It's him. The clock on the wall of the medical room read 11:47 Daniel Cross sat in that chair for another 30 seconds. He thought about the maintenance log, the 3rd page. He thought about the 14 months of VP operations directives. He thought about the engineering team that had signed off on the aircraft. He thought about how many people it takes to build a culture where a safety warning gets absorbed and redirected and relabeled until it looks like normal business. He thought about the 19 other aircraft in the Apex Horizon fleet. Evelyn had said she was grounding them. But someone needed to know what they were looking for. Howell, he said, after the NTSB, you need to call your union rep. Today, before end of business. Already texted him from the ambulance. The corner of Howell's mouth moved. 18 years, I know how this part goes. Good. Daniel stood. He reached out and shook Howell's hand again. One more thing, Howell said, still holding the handshake. What you said to me on final, fear can sit beside you, but it can't touch the controls. He looked at Daniel steadily. I'm going to tell my daughters that, when they're old enough. I don't know what they're going to need it for, but I'm going to tell them. Daniel Cross nodded once. He picked up his flight bag. He walked out into the corridor, and at 11:49 a.m., in the lobby of the airport medical facility, he nearly walked directly into Marcus Vale. It wasn't subtle. Marcus Vale was coming through the front door of the building with a younger man in a suit company legal. Daniel's mind categorized automatically, and he looked up and saw Daniel at exactly the same moment Daniel saw him. They were 12 feet apart. The lobby was not empty. There were 6 other people in it, the desk nurse, 2 passengers in waiting chairs, a security officer near the far exit, the young lawyer who'd been talking to Vale and had now stopped talking and was reading the air, with the speed of someone professionally trained to do exactly that. Marcus Vale stopped walking. He had always been a man whose face was very well managed. It had been well managed in the hangar this morning when he stood behind Evelyn Carter. It had been well managed in the control tower while he watched the telemetry display. It had been less well managed when he put his face in his hands. But even then, there was something calculated about the gesture. Something that understood how it would read. Right now the management had slipped. Just slightly. Just for 2 seconds. But Daniel Cross had spent a career reading the faces of people under pressure, and in those 2 seconds he saw everything he needed to see. He saw fear, not remorse, not guilt in the clean, clear sense. Fear, the specific, self-interested fear of a man whose accounting of the morning had concluded that the up of the last 2 hours had been very bad for him in particular. Then the management came back. Marcus Vale straightened his jacket. He reset his expression to something controlled and professional, and walked forward at his normal pace. "Cross," he said, as if they'd run into each other at a trade conference. "Marcus." Daniel's voice was entirely neutral. They were 6 feet apart now. The young lawyer had his eyes moving between them, with the expression of someone watching a situation that he has not been briefed on, but is rapidly developing opinions about. "I'm glad the aircraft came down safely," Marcus said. He said it like a statement of corporate policy. Rehearsed, appropriate, revealing nothing. The company is going to be conducting a full internal review and cooperating completely with the NTSB investigation. I want you to know that. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. He thought about what Howell had just told him. The call, 30 minutes before departure. The phrase full context, the paper trail being built before wheels up. He thought about 14 months of VP operations directives. He thought about the engineer who had written within operational tolerance because Marcus had given him the language to disappear a problem. He thought about 186 people. 11 children under 12, he said very quietly, "Marcus. The NTSB has my inspection report from 6:47 this morning. Time-stamped. They have your override of that report. They have the engineer's notation with your directive cited by name. And in about 20 minutes, they're going to have Captain Howell's account of the call you made to the cockpit 30 minutes before departure." He paused. "The call where you told him you just wanted him to have full context." Something happened to Marcus Vale's face. It was not dramatic. It was not a collapse. It was subtler than that, a very small, very specific rearrangement that happened below the management layer, in the place that management couldn't quite reach when the information arriving was exactly this bad and exactly this precise. The young lawyer reached out and put his hand on Marcus Vale's arm. "Sir," he said, quiet, direct, the professional equivalent of a hand on a steering wheel. Marcus Vale looked at Daniel Cross for one more second. Then he looked away, and in that moment, in the looking away, was everything that the morning had cost the full architecture of what he'd built, and what he'd allowed, and what he'd calculated, and what he'd decided to risk with other people's lives and other people's children. Assembled in one silent, available moment before the lawyer moved them toward a corner of the lobby to begin the work of managing what came next. Daniel Cross watched him walk away. Then he walked through the front door of the medical facility and out into the thickening morning air. The storm cell was closer now. He could feel it in the pressure, in the specific quality of the wind. He stood there for a moment with his flight bag over his shoulder and his eyes on the sky. His phone rang. Tyler Reed. He answered it this time. Mr. Cross. Tyler's voice sounded different, not the easy, performance-confident tone that Daniel had heard in the hangar for 3 years. Something stripped down. Quieter in the way things go quiet when the unnecessary has been removed. I know I have no standing to call you. I know that after this morning I don't have any claim on your time, and I just needed to say something. Say it. A pause. I said some things, I made some jokes. About you. About the way you do your job. Things that I said in front of people and that I thought I was being smart. I thought I understood what I was seeing. His voice was doing something unsteady. I didn't understand anything, not even close. And he stopped. I'm sorry, that's all. I'm sorry, and it's inadequate, and I know it, and I'm still saying it. Daniel stood on the sidewalk outside the medical facility. He thought about a kid in a hangar with folded arms and an easy laugh. He thought about Tyler Reed at 29, talented and confident in the way that talented people sometimes are before reality has fully introduced itself. He thought about himself at 29. Tyler, he said, when's the last time you did a full manual inspection, not digital. Hands on the panels, ears on the engines, the whole thing. A pause, months, maybe longer, start doing it again. Every flight, a beat, not because someone's watching, because you should know your aircraft better than any computer does. Silence. That's it, Tyler said. That's it. You're not going to. I insulted you in front of people. Repeatedly. For months, I know. Daniel picked up his keys. I was also 29 once. I didn't always understand what I was looking at either. He paused. The difference is you made the call. Most people in that situation don't. Tyler Reed didn't say anything for a moment. Then I want to learn what you know. Daniel Cross stood by his truck in the Florida morning with a storm moving in, and his flight bag over his shoulder and a phone against his ear. He thought about saying no. He thought about what it would cost and what it would mean and whether he had any more to give this particular organization and these particular people after the morning they'd just collectively had. He thought about what a safety culture actually required. Not regulations, not directives. People who knew what they were doing and why they were doing it, and who understood the full weight of what happened when they got it wrong. He thought about those 11 children under 12. Meet me Monday morning, he said, 6 a.m. Hangar 3. We'll start with the pre-fleet. The call ended. Daniel Cross got in his truck. It was 12:03 p.m. Lily had half a day of school left and needed to be picked up at 3:45. He had 2 hours before the NTSB meeting that Alan Pruitt had scheduled at the regional office. He sat for a moment in the driver's seat, with his hands on the wheel and the engine off. He thought about the morning, about a badge snatched off his chest in front of 43 people, about the distance between that moment and this one, about the shape of what had happened in between. He thought about Raymond saying Viper 1 like it was a door opening. He thought about Evelyn Carter holding herself with her own arms at the tower window. He thought about James Howell saying his wife's voice wasn't steady. He thought about Marcus Vail looking away. He thought about Sophie, the young controller, asking how he'd known he could do it. He started the truck. He pulled out of the lot. He drove 4 blocks before his phone rang again, and this time it was a number he recognized immediately, the direct line for the office of the FAA Southwest Regional Administrator. A number he hadn't seen in 3 years. He answered it on the second ring. Cross speaking Daniel, a woman's voice, senior. He recognized it. Regional Administrator Patricia Diaz, 60 years old, former commercial pilot, person who ran the regulatory framework that governed every aircraft Apex Horizon flew. He had spoken to her twice in 3 years, both times in formal investigative contexts. I'm going to skip the preamble because you've already had a complicated morning. We need to talk about Apex Horizon's fleet. I understand they're being grounded voluntarily. That was my recommendation. It was the right call. But here's the thing, Daniel. Our preliminary review of what the NTSB is bringing us from this morning indicates we may be looking at systematic, institutional maintenance fraud. Not an error, not a judgment call, fraud. She paused. In which case, voluntary groundings are not going to be sufficient. We're going to need to move on this at the company level, which means we're going to need someone who understands Apex Horizon's specific aircraft fleet, their maintenance protocols, and the scope of what Marcus Vail's directives may have altered over the last 14 months. Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. You're asking me to consult. I'm asking you to come in, Patricia Diaz said. Today, with everything you have. Another pause. I also want you to know that we have a preliminary record of your termination this morning. The timestamp is Daniel. You were fired 47 minutes before that aircraft declared an emergency. The sequence of events is documented, and it is going to matter enormously to what happens next. He thought about Lily. He thought about 345. He thought about a building full of regulators about to dismantle something that had been carefully constructed over 14 months to look like acceptable aviation management. He thought about what it would take to make sure no other aircraft in any other fleet was flying today on a maintenance log that said within operational tolerance because someone's boss needed the schedule intact. I can be there by 2, he said. We'll be ready, Patricia Diaz said. He hung up. He drove. And 3 miles behind him, in the Apex Horizon Operations Center, Evelyn Carter was sitting at a conference table with 2 of her board members on a video call, her fleet grounded, her VP of Operations in a corner of a medical facility lobby with a lawyer, her NTSB disclosure process underway, and a company that looked, from any objective angle, like it was standing at the edge of something enormous. She had her phone on the table in front of her. She was not looking at the board members on the screen. She was looking at the maintenance log, the third page. The notation, within operational tolerance per VP Operations Directive. She had read it 17 times in the last 40 minutes. She kept reading it because she was trying to understand exactly when she had created the conditions for someone to write that sentence and believe it was acceptable. She was trying to locate the specific moment the meeting, the quarterly pressure call, the cost review, the schedule alignment session where she had communicated clearly enough for someone to cite it in a safety document. That tolerance was something that could be adjusted by directive. She couldn't find the single moment because it wasn't a single moment. It was a culture. It was a culture she had built. And one of the board members on the screen was saying something about crisis communication strategy and the importance of controlling the narrative. And Evelyn Carter was looking at the maintenance log and thinking about a man in an 11-year-old jacket who had placed his inner palm and walked away, and thinking about what it meant that the clearest, most accurate picture of her company's safety culture had been living in his inspection logs for 3 years. Evelyn, the board member's voice sharper now. Evelyn, we need to discuss the public statement. She looked up. Cancel it, she said. I'm sorry? Cancel the public statement. We're not doing a PR response. We're doing a full disclosure to the NTSB, full cooperation with the FAA, and a complete audit of every maintenance decision Marcus Vail touched in the last 14 months. She closed the maintenance log. And I need someone to find me Daniel Cross's personal contact information, because he is not going to hear what I need to say to him through a press release. The board member blinked. Evelyn, from a liability standpoint. From a human standpoint, she said, and the way she said it ended the discussion. She set her phone face down on the table. Outside the conference room window, the storm cell had finally arrived. The first drops were hitting the glass, slow and heavy, the advance guard of what the radar had been promising all morning. Evelyn Carter sat in a company she had built and looked at the rain. And in the outer office, her assistant was already pulling up Daniel Cross's contact file. And in a federal building 4 miles away, Alan Pruitt of the NTSB was reviewing time-stamped inspection photographs that had arrived in his email at 10:43 a.m. and were telling him a story about institutional pressure that he had, in 22 years of aviation investigation, seen variations of before. But never this clearly documented, never this complete. And Marcus Vail, in a corner of a medical facility lobby, had just said 6 words to his lawyer that the lawyer was going to spend the next 3 weeks wishing he hadn't heard. How much can they actually prove? The lawyer had looked at him and answered honestly, the federal building at exactly 1:58 p.m. Daniel Cross walked through the front entrance 2 minutes early, which was the only way he knew how to arrive anywhere. The lobby was federal standard muted colors, institutional lighting, the particular quality of air that comes from buildings where serious decisions get made and then filed in triplicate. A security officer checked his ID and directed him to the 4th floor. Alan Pruitt met him at the elevator. In person, Pruitt was smaller than his voice had suggested, compact, mid-60s, with the kind of economical movement that belongs to people who have spent decades doing work that requires precision over spectacle. He shook Daniel's hand with a firm, brief grip and said nothing about the morning, nothing about the landing, nothing about what the last 4 hours had clearly cost everyone involved. He said, "We have a lot of ground to cover. Come with me." They walked to a conference room where 3 other people were already seated, 2 NTSB investigators, and a woman from the FAA's Aviation Safety Hotline Division, whom Pruitt introduced as Janet Morse. She was 58, serious-faced, with a legal pad already filled with handwritten notes. Patricia Diaz came in 30 seconds later and took the chair at the head of the table. Daniel sat across from all of them, with his flight bag on the floor by his chair, and his hands flat on the table, and the complete, organized attention of someone who has been in briefings before and knows how they work. "Let's start," Pruitt said, with 6:47 this morning. Daniel started at 6:47. He walked them through it with the same precision he'd used on every inspection log, every technical report, every documented safety concern for the last 3 years. He didn't editorialize. He didn't frame it. He gave them sequence, data, timestamp, decision, response, outcome. He gave them the conversation in the hangar. He gave them the exact phrasing of his warning to Evelyn Carter and the exact phrasing of her dismissal. He gave them Marcus Vale's position relative to that conversation, and the way Vale had caught his eye for half a second and looked away. Janet Morse's pen moved steadily. When he finished, Patricia Diaz was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The photographs you sent this morning. You said you photograph your inspection logs. Every inspection. Everyone. For 3 years, how many aircraft?" 19 over that period. Some rotated out of the fleet. Active fleet currently is 14 aircraft. Pruitt leaned forward. "Mr. Cross, in those 3 years of documented inspections, how many times did you flag a concern through official channels that was subsequently overridden or dismissed by operations management?" Daniel looked at him steadily. 14 times. The room absorbed that number. 14 times. Not this morning. 14 mornings. 14 reports. 14 documented instances of a safety concern being filtered through Marcus Vale's office and emerging on the other side, labeled something other than what it was. "I have documentation for all 14, Daniel said. Timestamps, the original report, the response, and in 11 of the 14 cases, my own follow-up notes about what I subsequently observed in the aircraft during later inspections." He reached into his flight bag and produced a manila folder. Old-fashioned, paper, the kind that federal investigators actually preferred because digital files can be altered and paper can be dated with independent forensic methods. He set it on the table. Pruitt reached for it. Janet Morse set down her pen. Daniel said, page 7, February 14, I flagged a hydraulic coupling on the number 3 aircraft. Vale's office marked it resolved 4 days later. The aircraft continued in service. I re-inspected that aircraft on March 2nd and photographed the coupling. The photograph is on page 9. It is the same coupling, in the same condition, with a resolution notation on its maintenance record that does not reflect any actual repair work. The room was very quiet. Patricia Diaz looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she said, "Janet, get the general counsel on the phone." Now at 2:34 p.m., while Daniel was still in the federal building, Evelyn Carter was sitting in her own conference room across town when her assistant knocked and leaned in with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way of someone who has learned to deliver bad news without additional drama. "Miss Carter, the FAA has issued a temporary flight restriction order on the full Apex Horizon fleet. It's official. 14 aircraft, indefinite ground stop pending investigation." Evelyn had already grounded the fleet voluntarily 2 hours ago. She knew this was coming. She had, in fact, expected it. What she had not expected was the board member who had been talking about crisis communications strategy calling back 20 minutes later with a very different set of questions. Questions about her personal exposure, questions about what she had known and when. Questions that had the specific architectural shape of people beginning to calculate whether she was an asset or a liability. She had listened to the questions. She had answered them directly and honestly, which was not what the board member wanted and which she did not care about, even slightly. Then she had hung up and told her assistant to book a flight to Washington, D.C. for the following morning because the conversation she needed to have with the NTSB and the FAA was not one that should be handled through lawyers and press releases. She was going to walk in and tell them everything she knew. Every pressure directive, every schedule call, every quarterly meeting where cost management had been discussed in language that gave Marcus Vale the cover he needed to do what he'd done. She was going to name herself as a contributing factor in the culture that had produced this morning. Because she was one, and because pretending otherwise in federal testimony was the kind of decision that turned a very bad situation into an irreparable one. Her assistant was looking at her. "The flight," Evelyn said. "Book it. Yes, ma'am, and get me Daniel Cross on the phone." The assistant paused. "I have a number for him. Call it." Daniel was walking out of the federal building into the rain when his phone rang. He looked at the screen, Apex Horizon main office line. He stood under the overhang and answered it. "This is Daniel Cross." "Mr. Cross," a young woman's voice. "Please hold for Ms. Carter." He held 3 seconds. Daniel, Evelyn's voice. Different again. Not the CEO from the hangar this morning. Not the person holding herself at the tower window. Something else, something that had gone through several transformations in the last 5 hours, and arrived somewhere more stripped down than any of them. "I'm going to Washington tomorrow. I'm going to tell them everything." He waited. "I want you to know that before you hear it from someone else. I'm not managing this. I'm done managing things that should have been handled honestly a long time ago. A breath. I also want to say something to you that I should have said at 10:31 when you walked out of the tower. But I was too, I don't know what I was. To something. Say it now, Daniel said. What you did this morning, what you've been doing for 3 years. Showing up and doing the job correctly and filing accurate reports. And refusing to let people tell you that safety was a scheduling consideration. That is the only reason 186 people are home with their families tonight. She stopped. Then, and the way I treated you this morning was a profound, inexcusable failure of my judgment and my character. I am sorry, Daniel. Not as a legal matter. As a person who looked at you and saw the wrong things for the wrong reasons, and made decisions based on that failure of seeing. I am genuinely, specifically sorry. Daniel Cross stood in the rain. He'd stepped out from the overhang slightly, because the rain felt appropriate, and held the phone against his ear. He thought about what an apology required to be real. He'd thought about this before, in other contexts, in the particular education that single parenting provides about the difference between words and their meaning. A real apology required the person offering it to understand specifically what they'd done wrong. Not in general, specifically. Evelyn Carter had just named it specifically. I hear you, he said. A pause. That's all? That's not nothing, he said. I hear you. I believe you mean it. That matters. He paused. The rest of it, what the company does from here. How the investigation goes, that's its own thing. You do what's right with the regulators. You do what's right by the people who work for you. That's the accountability part. And you, she said. What happens with you? It was a real question. He could tell it was a real question, not strategy, not preamble. She genuinely didn't know, and she was asking directly. He looked at the parking lot. The rain was steady now, the storm having arrived and settled in the way Florida storms do, committed, unhurried, having made its point. I'm going to pick up my daughter at 3:45, he said. After that, I'll figure it out. He heard something in her voice that might have been a laugh and might have been the other side of one. Okay, she said, Evelyn. He paused. Ground everything until you know what you have. Don't let anyone pressure you into a partial grounding. The entire fleet until every maintenance log has been independently reviewed. Not by Marcus Vale's team, by outside auditors. Already in motion, she said. Good. Another pause. One more thing. The engineers who signed off on aircraft under Vale's directives, most of them were doing what they were told in a culture that made it easier to comply than to push back. The investigation is going to want to assign individual responsibility, and some of that will be appropriate. But the engineers who come forward on their own, who tell the investigators exactly the pressure they were done, those people deserve consideration. Silence. Then you're asking me to protect whistleblowers. I'm saying the culture created the conditions. Some people were caught inside it. Others built it. He let that sit. There's a difference. I understand the difference, Evelyn said quietly. He hung up. He got in his truck. The clock read 3:02 p. He had 43 minutes before he needed to be at Lily's school. He drove. The city moved past him in the rain palm trees, strip malls, the particular Florida geography that he'd spent 8 years navigating in the context of his daughter's life. The school was on the far side of the suburb, in a neighborhood where the houses had small yards and the streets had speed bumps. And the parents who did pick up were mostly women in their 30s, and a few men of various ages who all nodded at each other in the specific fellowship of people showing up. He pulled into the pickup lane at 3:39 p.m. He put the truck in park. He looked at the school's front entrance, and he felt something loosen in his chest. Something that had been held tight since approximately 6:30 that morning, since he'd first touched the G700's flight control panel, and felt what he felt and known what he knew and understood that the day was going to be the kind of day it turned out to be. The door opened at 3:44. Lily came out in the first wave. She was tall for 15, she'd gotten that from him, with dark hair pulled back and the specific walk of a teenager who is comfortable in her own body in a way that had taken a long time and some painful intermediate steps to arrive at. She was wearing the hoodie she'd bought last October that said something ironic on the front that he'd never been able to read fast enough before she moved away. She saw his truck, she saw his face through the windshield, and she changed direction immediately, not toward the passenger door, but around the front of the truck to the driver's side, which was not their routine, and she knocked on his window. He rolled it down. "You look terrible," she said. "Thank you." "Dad." He looked at her. She had Sarah's eyes. She had his stubbornness. She had the accuracy about people's emotional states that had been both remarkable and occasionally inconvenient since approximately age 7. "The airplane I was worried about this morning," he said. "It had a problem in the air." Her face went very still. "Was anyone hurt?" "No. Everyone's home." She searched his face for confirmation of that. Found it. Then she said, "You helped." Not a question. "Yeah," he said, "I helped." She was quiet for a moment. Behind her, the pickup lane was moving. Other kids streaming out. Parents pulling forward. She stood at his window in the rain, without seeming to notice she was getting wet, and she looked at him with the full, unguarded attention she'd been giving him her whole life. The attention that sometimes felt like the most honest thing in any room. "Get in the truck, Lily. You're getting soaked." "I don't care." But she moved around and opened the passenger door and got in, tossing her backpack in the back. She pulled her door shut and turned to face him. "Tell me," he told her. Not everything, not the technical details, not the regulatory conversation, not Marcus Vale and the lawyer in the medical facility lobby, but the shape of it, the morning, the badge, the emergency call, the tower, Howell's voice on the channel, the landing. He told it in the quiet, factual way that he told Lily things that mattered, which was without performance and without protection, because she was 15 and she was his daughter, and she deserved to know what her father's days actually looked like. When he finished, the school pickup lane was mostly empty. Lily sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "The woman who fired you. She actually ran across the airport to find you, in heels, on wet tarmac. It doesn't fix what she did, but that's something." "It's something," he agreed. "And the guy who covered up the maintenance stuff." She paused. "He's going to jail, right? That's not my decision." "But probably." The federal investigators have 14 documented instances of altered safety records. That is a significant evidentiary basis for a significant conversation. He glanced at her. "In legal terms, in human terms, he put 186 people on a plane he knew was broken because he didn't want to lose money." Her voice had an edge that he recognized. It came from the same place his stubbornness came from. And it was one of his favorite things about her, even when it was directed at him. "That's not a policy failure. That's a choice, yes," he said. "It is." She looked out the windshield at the rain on the glass. "Are you going back," she said, "to Apex Horizon?" The question he'd been sitting with since 11:49 this morning. "I don't know yet," he said. "It depends on a lot of things." What things? He thought about Tyler Reed asking to learn. He thought about Sophie, the young controller, asking how he'd known. He thought about the 14 aircraft still on the ground, and the maintenance culture that had grown in the space where honest reporting should have been. He thought about what it actually took to change a thing. Not fix a symptom, change the underlying condition. Whether there's something real to build, he said, or whether it's just damage control dressed up as reform. Lily considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "How will you know the difference?" "By watching what people do when nobody's watching them," he said. "It's always the same test." She nodded slowly. Then she reached over and put her hand on his arm. Not in a dramatic way, just there. Her hand on his arm, solid and present. The way she'd learned from watching him that presence was the thing that mattered when words ran short. He put his hand over hers for a moment. Then he put the truck in drive, and they headed home in the rain. At 4:47 p.m., while Daniel and Lily were eating leftover pasta at the kitchen table, and she was telling him about the polynomial quiz and Mrs. Patterson's grading policy, with the focused grievance of someone who had opinions and intended to share them fully, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Raymond Kessler. It said, "Turn on Channel 7 now." Daniel looked at Lily. She looked at his phone, then at him. "Go," she said. "I can see your face." He turned on the small kitchen TV. The local news was running the story, which he had expected. What he had not expected was the volume of it. The National Aviation Desk was already involved. The network Chiron reading, Apex Horizon, Emergency Landing Fleet, grounded federal investigation underway. They had footage of the aircraft on the runway. They had footage of the emergency vehicles. They had a reporter standing outside the federal building that Daniel had left 2 hours ago. Then they cut to footage he did not expect. Cell phone video. Shot from inside the terminal, through the glass, looking out at the operations area. It was grainy, shot at distance, but it was unmistakably the control tower building. And in the foreground of the shot, for approximately 4 seconds, a figure could be seen walking across the eye apron toward the tower entrance, with a flight bag over one shoulder. The reporter's voice, an unnamed source, is telling our affiliate that the emergency landing was guided from the ground by a former military aviation specialist who was, according to this source, fired by Apex Horizon this morning, just 47 minutes before the emergency was declared. Lily stopped twirling pasta around her fork. The reporter continued, "We're working to confirm the identity of this individual. What we can confirm at this hour is that the NTSB has opened a formal investigation into Apex Horizon's maintenance practices, that the company's VP of Operations is reportedly cooperating with investigators, and that the FAA has issued a full fleet ground stop effective immediately." Daniel picked up the remote and turned it off. Lily was looking at him. "Unnamed source," she said. "Probably Raymond," he said. "He has opinions about things being on record. He's not wrong." She set her fork down. "Dad, they're going to find out who you are, the news people. It's going to be you on that screen with a name under it." He looked at his pasta. "I know. How do you feel about that?" He thought about it, honestly. He'd spent 8 years being the person who wasn't famous for what he'd done. The person whose file was classified, whose call sign was known only to the people it needed to be known to, who showed up before dawn and checked aircraft and ate lunch alone in his truck and picked up his daughter at 3:45. He'd built that life deliberately, and he'd liked it. He'd liked the ordinariness of it in the way you like things that are hard to preserve and worth the effort. "I feel like it's good to complicate things," he said. "Yeah." She picked her fork back up. "It's also going to mean that the next time someone like Marcus Vale decides to override a safety report, there's a story that people know about what that costs." She looked at him steadily. "You told me one time that visibility isn't the point, that the work is the point. You're still right about that. But sometimes the visibility serves the work." He looked at his daughter. She looked back at him, completely unself-conscious about having just said something that was both accurate and, in a very specific way, exactly what Sarah would have said. "When did you get so smart?" he said. "I've always been this smart," she said. "You just only recently started paying full attention." He laughed. It was the first time he'd laughed since before 6:30 that morning, and it felt like something releasing that had been under pressure for a long time. His phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. New York area code. He looked at it, let it ring, let it go to voicemail. It rang again before the voicemail notification appeared. Different number, same area code. He silenced it and put it face down on the table. "Media," Lily said. "Starting. How many do you think by morning?" He thought about it. The story had everything that made aviation emergencies major news events. A full passenger load, a dramatic landing, now a federal investigation and a corporate scandal, with a traceable human decision-maker. Add the detail about the fired pilot and the 47-minute gap, and you had the kind of sequence that went national by midnight and international by morning. "Enough," he said. "Are you going to talk to them?" "No." "Good." She went back to her pasta. "Let the story tell itself. You don't need to manage it." He looked at her. She shrugged. "That's what you always say." "I say a lot of things." "You say that one a lot." She pointed at him with her fork. "Eat your pasta. You haven't eaten properly since 5:30. He ate his pasta. At 6:15 p.m., 3 things happened within 12 minutes of each other. First, Alan Pruitt of the NTSB released a statement confirming that a formal investigation had been opened into Apex Horizon Aviation's maintenance practices, that the investigation had already identified documentary evidence of systemic safety record manipulation, and that the NTSB would be requesting cooperation from all current and former Apex Horizon maintenance personnel. The statement did not name Marcus Vale. It named no individuals. But the phrase, systemic safety record manipulation, was specific enough and damning enough that every aviation journalist in the country understood exactly what it meant and where it pointed. Second, Marcus Vale's attorney issued a brief statement saying that his client was cooperating fully with all relevant authorities and had no further comment at this time. The phrase cooperating fully in that context, following the NTSB's use of systemic safety record manipulation, had the particular quality of a person getting ahead of something that was already moving faster than they could run. Third, Tyler Reed sent Daniel a text that said, "I looked up your service record. As much of it as is publicly accessible." A pause, represented by 3 separate message bubbles. "Then I owe you more than 6 a.m. Monday. I owe you about 3 years." Daniel read the text. He typed back, "Monday is fine." Bring coffee. He set the phone down. Lily had migrated to the couch with her homework and was watching him from across the room, with the peripheral awareness of a teenager who knows when a parent is processing something important. "Dad," she said without looking up from her notebook. "Are you okay?" He thought about the question. He thought about the morning. The badge, the hangar, the tower. Howell's voice saying we're down. Evelyn's hand flat against the tower window glass. Marcus Vale looking away. Sophie asking how he'd known. He thought about Sarah, who would have said, "Eat your eggs." He thought about 8 years of ordinary mornings that were never actually ordinary, just the most important thing, assembled day by day, one school pickup at a time. "Yeah," he said, "I'm okay." She looked up then, looked at him properly. "Good," she said, and went back to her homework. He sat in the kitchen for a while longer. His phone continued to buzz with numbers he didn't recognize, and he continued to decline them, and the rain continued against the windows. And somewhere across the city 14 aircraft sat on the ground in the dark, and the investigation moved forward on its own momentum, and Captain James Howell was home with his wife and his 2 daughters, 7 and 9, telling them something that would take several attempts to get fully said. And in a federal building that was still lit at 6:15 in the evening, Patricia Diaz and Alan Pruitt and Janet Morse were working through a Manila folder that had been building, document by document and inspection log by inspection log for 3 years. At 7:03 p.m., Daniel Cross's phone rang one more time. He almost declined it. He looked at the screen. It was a number with a 703 area code. Northern Virginia, the specific geography of Federal Aviation and Military Aviation Administration. He answered it. Cross, a voice he had not heard in 4 years. Male, late 50s, with the specific vocal economy of a career military officer who chose every word the way a navigator chooses a route directly, efficiently, and without unnecessary detours. General Mitchell Crane, former commanding officer of the 58th Special Operations Wing at Kirtland Air Force Base. The man who had signed Daniel's commendations. The man who had, 4 years ago on a call that lasted 9 minutes, told Daniel that the work he'd done mattered, and would continue to matter, even in whatever civilian context he chose next. "General," Daniel said. "I watched the news," Crane said. "And then I read what they're not putting on the news yet, because I have friends who know things." A pause. 14 documented instances. 3 years of consistent reporting in a system designed to ignore you. And then 47 minutes after they fired you, 186 people needed you to still be paying attention. Another pause. "That's not luck, Cross, that's character. I want you to know that I said that to 3 different people today, and I'll say it to 3 more if I need to." Daniel sat with that. "I appreciate it, General. I also want you to know something else." Crane's voice shifted slightly, not softer, exactly, but more direct in a different way. "There are people in Washington right now who are paying attention to this story for reasons that go beyond Apex Horizon. Aviation safety regulation has been a pressure point for 18 months. There are going to be conversations in the next 2 weeks about the systems, the reporting systems, the oversight structures, the culture of enforcement that allows something like what Vale was doing to persist for 14 months in a regulated industry." He paused. "Those conversations are going to need people who have been inside the problem, people who can speak to what it actually looks like from the ground level when institutional pressure overrides safety judgment." Daniel understood where this was going. "You're telling me there's going to be a hearing. I'm telling you there may be a request," Crane said. "And I'm telling you before anyone official tells you, because I want you to have time to think about it without a camera in your face." A pause. "I know you didn't want this. I know you built something quiet and you'd rather keep it that way. I know your priority is your daughter and your work and your life the way you've put it together." He stopped. "But Daniel, you've been doing this for 3 years in a company that didn't want to hear it. The only reason it matters now is because of this morning. The question is whether this morning stays a story about Apex Horizon, or whether it becomes a story about what has to change." The kitchen was quiet, rain on the windows, Lily on the couch with her notebook. Daniel Cross sat at his kitchen table with the phone against his ear and thought about 14 aircraft on the ground, and 14 documented instances of overridden safety reports, and an engineer who had written per VP Operations directive, because the culture made it easier to comply than to push back. He thought about Sophie asking how he'd known he could do it. He thought about Tyler Reed, Monday 6 a.m., Hangar 3. He thought about the question Lily had asked him in the truck, whether there was something real to build, or just damage control dressed as reform. He said, "Send me whatever they send me, I'll read it." Crane was quiet for a moment. "Then that's all I'm asking. For now, General." Daniel paused. "How many people know about Viper 1 in the current regulatory circles? How many people actually know what that call sign means? A beat. By tomorrow morning," Crane said, "more than you're comfortable with." Daniel Cross set his phone face down on the kitchen table. He looked at the ceiling. Then he looked at Lily, who was watching him over the top of her notebook with Sarah's eyes and his stubbornness, and the accuracy about people's emotional states that had been both remarkable and occasionally inconvenient since approximately age 7. "Another call?" she said. "Yeah, important?" He thought about it. About tomorrow and the day after, and the specific, complicated, consequential shape of what came next. "Possibly," he said. She studied his face for a moment. Then she put down her notebook and said, "Tell me." And he did. Outside, the storm was finally passing. The rain thinned out, and the wind changed direction, and somewhere to the east the pressure was shifting. The kind of slow, systemic correction that happens when a front has run its course, and the atmosphere has decided what it's going to be next. In 14 hours, the story would be on every major network in the country. In 36 hours, there would be a formal congressional inquiry request sitting on 3 different desks in Washington. In 72 hours, Marcus Vail would surrender his passport. But that was all still ahead. Right now, it was just a father and his daughter in a kitchen in Florida, with the rain going quiet against the windows, and an old flight bag on the floor by the door, and a conversation that had been a long time coming, finally finding its shape. And the cartoon fox sticker on the bottom of the flight bag caught the kitchen light at a certain angle and glowed orange, the way it always did, the way Lily had always said it would. The story broke nationally at 6:47 a.m. the following morning. Daniel knew because his phone woke him at 6:49 with a text from Raymond that said only, "It's everywhere. You okay?" He lay in bed for exactly 30 seconds, listening to the rain that had stayed through the night, still tapping against the window, with the patience of something that intended to outlast the morning. Then he got up, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen counter, reading the coverage on his phone. With the same attention, he gave maintenance logs not for what it said about him, but for what it revealed about the gaps between what had actually happened and what the story required. The gaps were significant. Most outlets had the broad shape right. Fired pilot, 47-minute gap, emergency landing, federal investigation. But the details were constructed around what was available, which meant the details were partly accurate and partly the narrative that the available details most conveniently supported. Several pieces had his military background wrong. One called him a decorated combat pilot, which he was not. He was a decorated emergency aviation specialist, which was a different thing. And the distinctions mattered to him in the specific way that precision mattered to him about everything. One piece, from a reporter he didn't recognize at a publication he didn't know, had gotten something right that none of the others had. A single sentence, buried in the 14th paragraph. Cross filed 14 separate safety reports over a 3-year period at Apex Horizon. All 14 were overridden by operations management. He continued filing them anyway. He read that sentence twice. He continued filing them anyway. He set his phone down and drank his coffee. Lily came downstairs at 7:15 in her school clothes, saw his face, and said, "How bad is it?" "Manageable." She poured herself coffee. She'd started drinking it 6 months ago, a development he'd accepted with the specific amused resignation of a parent who knows which battles matter, and looked at his phone screen. "They got your branch of service wrong, I noticed. Are you going to correct it?" "No." She nodded, like that was the right answer. "The 14 reports thing is good, that's the real story." She handed him back his phone. "The rest of it is just noise. The rest of it is going to be very loud noise for a while." "Yeah." She picked up her backpack. "But you've been in loud situations before." She looked at him steadily. "You just go quiet and do the work. That's your whole thing." He looked at his daughter. He thought about Sarah, who would have said something similar, and probably followed it with a comment about the coffee being too strong. "Bus in 8 minutes," he said. "I know." She was already at the door. "Dad." She stopped with her hand on the doorknob and looked back at him. "Whatever they ask you to do in Washington." Whatever the hearing thing is. Do it. He raised his eyebrows. He hadn't told her about General Crane's call in those specific terms. I'm 15, she said, not 5. She opened the door. Do it. 14 reports, remember? You've been trying to say this for 3 years. Say it where it counts. The door closed. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Alan Pruitt. Pruitt answered on the second ring, which told Daniel he'd been awake for some time. Cross, I was going to call you at 8. I'm calling you at 7:17, Daniel said. What do you need from me today? A pause. Then something that was almost warmth in Pruitt's voice, the federal investigator equivalent of warmth, which was restraint performed with slightly more care than usual. Your full availability. We're moving faster than we expected on the Vail documentation. The Attorney General's office is involved as of 9 o'clock this morning. Daniel's hand tightened slightly on the phone. The Attorney General's office was a significant escalation. That was not a regulatory conversation anymore. That was a criminal conversation. What did they find, he said, beyond the 14 instances you documented? Pruitt paused. Our forensic team spent the night in the Apex Horizon records system. Total altered or suppressed safety reports attributed to VP Operations directives, going back 18 months 31, across the full fleet of 14 aircraft. In 6 cases, the aircraft in question subsequently underwent in-service incidents that were logged as unexplained anomalies and closed without investigation. 31. Daniel had known about 14. He had documented 14. The other 17 had happened in the spaces between his inspections. On aircraft he didn't cover every cycle, in the gaps that a single senior pilot, with a notebook and a camera, couldn't fill alone. 31 safety reports. 6 in-service incidents closed without investigation, and an aircraft carrying 186 people, including 11 children under 12. What time do you need me? He said. 8:30. Same building, I'll be there at 8:15. He hung up. He put his mug in the sink. He picked up his flight bag, the one with the cartoon fox sticker, and walked out the door into the still raining morning. The federal building at 8:15 had a different quality than it had at 2 p. the previous day. More people, more urgency in the way those people moved. A second conference room had been opened, adjacent to Pruitt's, and through the glass wall, Daniel could see 3 people he didn't recognize working at laptops with the focused intensity of professionals who had been handed something significant and were in the process of understanding exactly how significant. Patricia Diaz met him in the corridor outside the main conference room. She had clearly not been home. She was in the same clothes as the previous afternoon, which on her managed to look like a decision rather than an oversight. Before we go in, she said, I need you to know something. Marcus Vail's attorney called our office at 6:30 this morning. Vail wants to make a proffer agreement. Daniel looked at her. He's offering to cooperate. He's offering to name names, she said. Specifically, he is claiming that he operated under direct instruction from Evelyn Carter to prioritize schedule compliance over safety compliance, and that he has documentation of those instructions. The corridor was very quiet for a moment. Daniel thought about Evelyn Carter's voice on the phone the previous afternoon, the specific quality of it, the accountability in it that had cost her something real to offer. He thought about what Marcus Vail had said in the medical facility lobby. How much can they actually prove? He thought about the arithmetic of a man who had spent his career calculating exposure and had now calculated that the best asset he had left was someone else's name. He's lying, Daniel said. It was not an emotional statement. It was an assessment. Diaz looked at him carefully. What makes you say that? Because I worked for Evelyn Carter for 3 years. She applied pressure, cost pressure, schedule pressure, the kind of pressure that creates environments where people like Vail can operate. That's real, and she knows it, and she's going to own it. He paused. But the 14 documented overrides are all in Vail's name. The directive language is his. The calls to the engineering team were his. I watched that operation for 3 years, and the pattern is Vail's pattern, not Carter's. He paused again. Vail is trying to trade a bigger name for a shorter sentence. That's calculation, not confession. Diaz studied him. You understand that Evelyn Carter is not your responsibility, she said carefully. Whatever happened between you and her yesterday is separate from what I'm telling you, he said. I'm telling you what the evidence shows. The evidence shows Marcus Vail. I have 3 years of observations supporting that assessment. If Vail has documentation of Carter directives, you should review it. but you should review it knowing what I just told you." Diaz looked at him for a long moment, then she said, "Come inside." The morning moved fast, faster than any meeting Daniel had been in since his military days, when the pace of decisions was set by operational urgency and the luxury of deliberate process was something you got afterward, not during. He walked Pruitt's team through every one of his 14 documented instances in precise, sequential detail. He answered questions for 2 hours without notes, because the notes were in the folder, and the folder was on the table, and everything in the folder was also in his memory, where it had been living since the morning he filed each report. At 10:40, Janet Morse came in from the adjoining conference room and set a printed document on the table in front of Pruitt. Pruitt read it. He looked up at Daniel. "Vale's alleged Carter documentation," he said. 18 emails, reviewed by our team this morning." He paused. 3 of them are direct Carter communications. The other 15 are Vale's own emails, written to his team, characterizing Carter's general directives in language that implies specific safety override authority that the original Carter communications don't actually contain. The room was quiet. "He manufactured the paper trail," Daniel said. "He retrofitted it," Pruitt said. The Carter emails say things like, "We need schedule compliance this quarter, and client relationships are a priority." Vale's forwarded summaries to his team say, per CEO directive, maintenance scheduling should prioritize operational availability. Those are not the same instruction. Daniel thought about the engineer who had written per VP operations directive in a safety notation. He thought about the chain of language, how a general pressure becomes a specific excuse, becomes a documented justification, becomes a culture. How each link in that chain has a person who chose to forge it. "The Carter emails," he said, "do any of them specifically instruct Vale to override safety reports?" "No," Pruitt said, "not one." Daniel nodded once. He thought about what Evelyn had said on the phone. "I created the conditions." She'd known that. She'd said it before she knew what Vale was going to try to do with it. That mattered. That was the difference between someone who understood their accountability and someone who was trying to manage their exposure. "She's flying in today," he said. "Carter. She said she was going to Washington to make a full disclosure." Pruitt glanced at Diaz. Something passed between them that Daniel couldn't fully read, but understood in outline, the specific exchange of people who have been working a case and have just received information that either confirms or complicates their current model. "We know," Diaz said. "She lands at noon. We have a meeting with her at 2. "She's not going to tell you what Vale says she told him," Daniel said. "She's going to tell you something more accurate and more damaging to herself, because that's what she decided to do." He paused. "She told me that before she knew what Vale was going to try." Diaz looked at him for a moment, then she made a note. At 11:15, Pruitt called a short break, and Daniel walked to the end of the corridor and stood at the window with a paper cup of bad Federal Building coffee and looked at the city in the still gray morning. His phone showed 47 missed calls. He went through them quickly, not listening to voicemails, just reading numbers. 14 media outlets, 3 numbers he didn't recognize with D.C. area codes, 2 from aviation industry contacts he knew distantly, 1 from Raymond, 1 from Tyler Reed, 1 from James Howell, and 1 from a number that made him stop, a Virginia number. Residential, not federal. He didn't recognize it, but he knew the area code. It was the same exchange as Kirtland Air Force Base Retiree Community Housing, where several former colleagues had settled after separation. He called it back. It rang twice. A woman answered. Older, steady voice, "Mr. Cross. My name is Ellen Vance. My husband was Gordon Vance. He was the flight engineer on an MC-130J out of Kirtland in 2009. Daniel went very still. Gordon Vance, he knew that name. He knew it with the specific, unshakable precision of someone who keeps certain memories in a locked room and knows exactly what's in it. Gordon Vance had been one of the crew on the aircraft Daniel had brought back in 2009. The incident that generated the call sign Viper 1. The 41 minutes that the official report had described as beyond established survivability parameters. Gordon Vance had died of a heart attack in 2021. Daniel had seen the obituary. "Mrs. Vance," he said. His voice was steady because he made it steady. "I'm sorry for your loss. Gordon was an exceptional. He talked about you," she said. "Not often. He didn't talk about that flight often. But when he did, he talked about your voice." She paused. "He said that when everything was wrong, and the numbers said they weren't coming back, Your voice was the thing that made him believe the numbers were wrong about it." She paused again. "I watched the news this morning. I saw what happened. And I wanted to call and tell you that what you did yesterday, talking that pilot down, Gordon would have recognized it. He would have known exactly what that cost, and he would have wanted to say something." Her voice was very steady. "So I'm saying it for him. Thank you for then, and for yesterday, and for all the mornings in between when you showed up and filed the reports that nobody wanted to hear." Daniel Cross stood at the end of a federal building corridor in Washington, D.C., with a paper cup of bad coffee and the phone against his ear. He thought about 41 minutes over a mountain range in New Mexico in 2009. He thought about Gordon Vance's voice on a radio channel, calm and working, doing his job in conditions the numbers said weren't survivable. He thought about the 18th incident, the one he didn't think about, the one where he'd done everything right and it hadn't been enough. He thought about Sarah on the kitchen floor at 2 in the morning. He thought about Lily saying, "Do it wherever it counts." "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," he said. "That means more than I can tell you." "I know," she said. "That's why I called." She hung up. He stood there for 30 more seconds. Then he walked back into the conference room and sat down and picked up his pencil and continued doing the work. The congressional hearing request arrived in writing at 4 p.m. that afternoon, delivered to the federal building by a Senate Commerce Committee staffer who handed Pruitt an envelope and left without small talk. Pruitt read it and handed it to Daniel without comment. It was formal, brief, and unambiguous. The Senate Commerce Committee was convening a special session on aviation safety regulatory oversight in 12 days. They were requesting the testimony of Daniel Cross, former senior pilot at Apex Horizon Aviation, regarding his documented experience of systemic safety reporting suppression and the events of the previous day. Daniel read it twice, then he handed it back to Pruitt. "I'll testify," he said. Pruitt took the letter. "You don't need to decide today." "I decided this morning." He paused. "I need one condition." "What condition?" "The engineers," he said. "The ones at Apex Horizon, who signed off on altered records under Vail's pressure. I want the committee to understand the distinction between people who built the system and people who got caught inside it. I'm going to make that distinction in my testimony, and I want it on record before I walk in there." Pruitt looked at him carefully. "You're protecting people who signed off on compromised safety records." "I'm making sure the investigation finds the right center of gravity," Daniel said. "The engineers who come forward and tell the full truth about what pressure they were under, those people are witnesses, not defendants. If the committee treats them like defendants, they stop talking. And if they stop talking, you lose the complete picture of how the culture operated." He paused. "You want the full story, so do I. That's how you get it." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll communicate that to the committee staff. Thank you." He left the federal building at 5:30 and drove straight to Lily's school. She'd stayed late for a study session, and picked her up in the parking lot in the still gray light of the evening. She got in the truck and looked at him and said, "You're going to testify?" "Yes," she nodded. "Good." He pulled out of the lot. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "I got a call today from the wife of a man I helped bring home a long time ago. Before Apex Horizon, before everything, he kept his eyes on the road. She called to say thank you, for then and for yesterday and for the time in between." Lily was quiet for a moment. "How did that feel?" she said. He thought about it. "Like something I didn't know I needed to hear," he said. She nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else about it, which was exactly right, because she understood, had always understood, the difference between the things that needed to be talked through and the things that needed to be carried quietly for a while before they became fully legible. They drove home. He made dinner. She set the table. They ate, and she told him about the study session, and he listened with the full, uncalculated attention that was the most reliable thing he gave her. And the evening moved through its ordinary architecture, and it was, despite everything, a good evening. At 9 p.m., she went upstairs, and he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and his old notebook, not the inspection log, a different one, older, the one he wrote in when he needed to put things down in order to see them clearly. He wrote 31 reports, 14 I knew about, 17 in the gaps. He wrote, "The gaps are the problem, not the individual failures, the system that makes the gaps." He wrote, "What you build is what you allow to exist inside it." He looked at that last sentence for a while. Then he wrote one more thing, And it was not about aviation, and not about Marcus Vail, and not about Senate committees or FAA regulations, or any of the large, complicated machinery that was now in motion around the events of the previous day. He wrote, Lily said do it where it counts. He closed the notebook. He put it back in his flight bag. The cartoon fox sticker caught the kitchen light. He smiled at it briefly, the way you smile at things that are both small and irreplaceable. Then he went to bed. 12 days later, Daniel Cross walked into the Senate Commerce Committee hearing room at 850A and took his seat at the witness table. He was wearing the same navy jacket. 11 years old, worn at the elbows, the breast pocket empty, the patch long removed, the space where it had been visible to anyone who looked closely enough. He did not have lawyers flanking him. He had a glass of water and his old notebook and the 3-year documentation file that Pruitt's team had assembled from his photographs and reports into a formal evidentiary record spanning 214 pages. The room was full, media on both sides, staff along the walls, committee members filing in with the unhurried authority of people who hold the gavel. Raymond Kessler was in the public gallery. He'd flown up the night before on his own time and money and had texted Daniel, wouldn't miss it. Don't be nervous. Daniel had texted back, I'm not nervous. Raymond had replied, I know, that's why I said it. Tyler Reed was there too. He'd asked 3 days earlier, and Daniel had said it was a public hearing and Tyler could make his own decisions about his own schedule. Tyler had shown up in a suit that looked like it had been recently purchased for the occasion, and when he found Daniel in the corridor beforehand, he hadn't said much. He'd just shaken Daniel's hand and said, I want to see how this is done. Daniel had said, pay attention, always, Tyler said. Captain James Howell was not in the room. He was home with his family, which was exactly where he should be, and he had submitted a written statement to the committee that Daniel had been permitted to read. The statement was precise and damaging and human, and the sentence that stayed with Daniel was near the end. In the 41 minutes between the emergency declaration and our landing, the voice of Daniel Cross was the architecture the crew used to hold the aircraft together. That is not a metaphor. That is a technical description. Evelyn Carter had testified the day before. Daniel hadn't been in the room for that, but Pruitt had briefed him on the broad content. She had told the committee everything. The pressure culture she'd built. The incentive structures that made Vail's behavior not just possible, but in the specific language she used, predictable. She had not minimized her role. She had not performed remorse. She had given the committee a clear, accountable account of the decision-making architecture she had created and what it had cost. Pruitt had said she'd been in there for 4 hours. He'd said she hadn't asked for a break once. Marcus Vail had entered a guilty plea 2 days earlier on 3 federal counts related to aviation safety record fraud. His attorney had negotiated a cooperation agreement. The plea included a statement of facts that confirmed Daniel's documented account on all 14 points and added 9 more that Vail had attempted to suppress through document deletion that the forensic team had recovered. There was no cooperation agreement that was going to make 23 altered safety reports over 18 months into something else. Some things had their own weight. The committee chairman called the hearing to order. He looked at the witness table. Mr. Cross, he said, we've read your documentation. We've reviewed the evidence. We have a lot of questions, but before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. He paused. You filed 14 safety reports over 3 years that were systematically ignored. You were fired 47 minutes before the emergency you had predicted, and you came back anyway. Why? The hearing room was very quiet. Daniel Cross looked at the chairman. He thought about 6:30 in the morning and a flight control panel that vibrated wrong. He thought about the 43 people in Hangar 7 who said nothing. He thought about a badge snatched off his chest and a parking lot, and Lily's voice saying, you know it wasn't your fault, right? He thought about Gordon Vance's wife saying thank you, for then and for yesterday, and for all the mornings in between. He thought about 186 people, and 11 children under 12. He thought about the 18th incident. The one he didn't think about, but thought about now, just for a second, in the specific way you acknowledge a scar not with grief, but with the honest recognition that it shaped you, and that the shaping was not without purpose. He leaned forward slightly. He said, because the aircraft didn't stop being dangerous when they fired me, and I didn't stop knowing what I knew. Those are the only 2 things that mattered. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then the chairman nodded, slowly, the way people nod when they've heard something that doesn't need augmentation. "Then let's begin," he said, and Daniel Cross opened his notebook to the first page, and he told them everything, and his voice was the same voice. It had always been steady, precise, and completely unafraid, the voice of a man who had been saying the same true thing for 3 years, and had finally found the room large enough to say it in. He was not Viper 1 in that room. He was not the military specialist with the classified commendations. He was not the story the news had been running for 12 days. He was a pilot who showed up before dawn and checked that aircraft and filed accurate reports and refused quietly, consistently, for 3 years and 14 reports and 1 catastrophic morning to let anyone treat the truth as a scheduling consideration. That was who he had always been. That was who he remained. And in the end, when the chips were counted, and the records were opened, and the full weight of what had almost happened settled into its permanent place in the history of aviation safety, that was the only thing that mattered. Real skill does not announce itself. Real character does not negotiate with convenience. And when the world needs someone to hold the line, it will always find the person who never stopped holding it, even when no one was watching, even when the room was empty, even when they took the badge off his chest and told him to go home. He went home, and when they needed him, he came back. That is what real looks like.